The Celtic world emerged from the archaeological shadows of Bronze Age Europe through a complex process of cultural development that spanned nearly a millennium. Archaeological evidence reveals that Proto-Celtic religious practices began taking recognisable form during the Late Bronze Age, approximately 1200, 800 BCE, with the Hallstatt culture representing the earliest clearly identifiable Celtic civilization. Excavations at the Hallstatt cemetery in Austria have uncovered over 2,000 graves containing distinctive bronze swords, elaborate horse harnesses, and imported Mediterranean goods, indicating a sophisticated society with established trade networks and social hierarchies. The transition from Bronze to Iron Age marked a crucial period in Celtic religious development. At Hallstatt, archaeologists discovered evidence of ritual deposits in nearby Lake Hallstatt, where hundreds of bronze and iron objects were deliberately thrown into the water as offerings. These votive deposits included weapons, jewellery, and ceremonial items, suggesting that bodies of water held sacred significance in early Celtic belief systems. Similar practices have been documented across Celtic territories, from the Thames in Britain to the Seine in Gaul, indicating widespread religious continuity. The Latenna period, beginning around 450 BCE, witnessed the full flowering of Celtic culture and mythology. Named after the archaeological site on Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, this era produced the distinctive Celtic art style characterised by flowing curves, stylised animals, and intricate knotwork patterns. The Latenne site itself contained numerous ritual deposits, including over 2,500 iron objects, many deliberately bent or broken before being cast into the lake. These damaged weapons and tools suggest ritual killing of objects to release their spiritual essence for use in the otherworld. Burial practices during the Latenna period reveal sophisticated beliefs about death and the afterlife. The Vix burial in Burgundy, dating to approximately 500 BCE, contained a Celtic princess interred with a massive bronze crater capable of holding 1,100 litres of wine, along with Etruscan and Greek luxury goods. The burial's orientation and the arrangement of grave goods suggest beliefs about the deceased's journey to an otherworldly realm where earthly possessions would be needed. Similar princely burials at Hochdorf in Germany and Rheinheim in the Saarland demonstrate consistent patterns of elite burial practices across Celtic territories. Sacred landscapes played a fundamental role in Celtic religious practice. Natural features such as springs, groves, hilltops and rivers were considered dwelling places of deities or portals to the other world. The sanctuary at Gournay-sur-Aronde in northern France exemplifies Celtic sacred architecture, featuring a square enclosure with a central pit where weapons and animal bones were ritually deposited. The site's use spanned 4 centuries, indicating long-term religious continuity and the importance of maintaining sacred spaces across generations. Oral tradition served as the primary vehicle for preserving and transmitting Celtic mythology across the centuries. Unlike their Mediterranean contemporaries, the Celts deliberately avoided writing down their sacred knowledge, believing that such practices would diminish the power and sanctity of their religious traditions. The Druids, who served as priests, judges and keepers of knowledge, underwent training periods lasting up to 20 years, during which they memorized vast collections of myths, genealogies, laws and ritual procedures. The structure of Celtic oral tradition followed specific patterns designed to aid memorization and ensure accurate transmission. Stories were organized around recurring themes, character types, and narrative formulas that could be adapted to different contexts while maintaining core mythological content. Professional storytellers, known as Philid in Ireland and Cyfarwydiaid in Wales, held prestigious positions in Celtic society and were responsible for preserving not only entertainment narratives, but also sacred knowledge about the gods, heroes, and the nature of reality itself. Seasonal festivals provided crucial opportunities for the transmission of mythological knowledge. During Samhain, the Celtic New Year marking the transition from summer to winter, communities gathered to hear stories about the Otherworld and its inhabitants. These narratives served multiple functions. They explained the changing seasons, reinforced social bonds, and provided moral instruction about proper behaviour toward both human and supernatural beings. The Festival of Beltane, celebrating the return of summer, featured stories about fertility deities and the renewal of life, while Lugh honoured the god Lugh and the harvest season. The geographic spread of Celtic peoples across Europe created a complex tapestry of related but distinct mythological traditions. From their probable origins in the alpine regions of Central Europe, Celtic-speaking peoples migrated westward into Gaul and Britain, southward into Iberia, and eastward into the Balkans and Asia Minor. Each region developed unique mythological characteristics while maintaining connections to broader Celtic themes and motifs. In Gaul, Celtic mythology blended with local pre-Celtic traditions and later Roman influences. The Gaulish pantheon included deities like Tuatha Dé, Essus, and Tyrannus, whose names appear in both classical sources and indigenous inscriptions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ribemont-sur-Ancre reveals ritual practices involving the display of human skulls and the careful arrangement of weapon deposits, suggesting beliefs about the power of severed heads and the sanctity of warfare. British Celtic mythology developed distinct characteristics, particularly in Wales and Scotland. The Welsh Mabinogion preserves stories of Pwyll, Manawydan, and other figures who demonstrate the complex relationship between the mortal world and the otherworld. Scottish Highland traditions maintained strong connections to landscape features, with specific mountains, lochs, and glens associated with particular deities or supernatural beings. Irish Celtic mythology represents perhaps the most complete preservation of ancient Celtic beliefs, largely due to the island's relative isolation from Roman conquest and the efforts of medieval Irish monks to record oral traditions. The Irish mythological cycles include the mythological cycle, featuring the Tuatha Dé Danann and their conflicts with earlier inhabitants of Ireland, and the Ulster cycle, centred on the hero Cú Chulainn and the warriors of the Red Branch. Iberian Celtic traditions developed unique characteristics through contact with indigenous populations and Mediterranean civilizations. The Celtiberians of central Spain maintained distinct burial practices and artistic styles while sharing broader Celtic religious concepts. Ritual deposits at sites like Postoloboso reveal the continuation of water-based offerings, while the warrior culture of the Celtiberians produced distinctive weapons and armour decorated with Celtic motifs. Central European Celtic communities, particularly in modern-day Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, maintained strong connections to the original Hallstatt and Latene traditions. The oppidum of Manching in Bavaria, one of the largest Celtic settlements, contained workshops producing coins, jewellery, and religious objects that demonstrate the continuation of Celtic artistic and spiritual traditions even under increasing Roman pressure. Early Celtic cosmology conceived of reality as consisting of multiple interconnected realms. The visible world of everyday experience existed alongside the other world, a parallel dimension inhabited by gods, spirits, and the dead. These realms were not separate but constantly interacting, with certain locations, times, and individuals serving as conduits between them. Sacred groves, springs, and hilltops functioned as liminal spaces where the boundaries between worlds became permeable. The concept of cyclical time pervaded Celtic thought, contrasting sharply with linear historical progression. The Celts understood time as moving in great cycles, with events, seasons, and even entire ages repeating in endless patterns. This cyclical worldview influenced their understanding of death and rebirth, the agricultural year, and the relationship between past, present, and future. Heroes and deities could appear in multiple time periods, and events in the mythological past continued to influence the present world. The interconnectedness of natural and supernatural realms formed a fundamental aspect of Celtic cosmology. Rivers, mountains, forests, and other landscape features were understood as living entities with their own spirits and personalities. The goddess Brigid, for example, was associated with both the sacred flame and the rivers that bore her name, while the god Cernunnos embodied the wild animals and forests of the natural world. This animistic worldview meant that human actions had consequences not only for other people, but for the entire web of relationships connecting all beings. The divine landscape of Celtic mythology reveals a complex hierarchy of deities whose influence extended across tribal boundaries while simultaneously manifesting in highly localized forms. Archaeological evidence from the 3rd century BCE onward demonstrates that certain gods achieved pan-Celtic status, their worship spreading from Ireland to Galatia through trade routes, military campaigns, and cultural exchange. These major deities embodied fundamental aspects of Celtic civilization: craftsmanship, warfare, fertility, and the sacred relationship between human communities and the natural world. Lugh stands as perhaps the most widely venerated pan-Celtic deity, his name appearing in inscriptions and place names across the entire Celtic world. Known as Lugus in Gaul, Lugh in Wales, and Lugh in Ireland, this god of skill and craftsmanship commanded reverence from artisans, warriors, and rulers alike. Archaeological evidence from Lugdunum reveals extensive ritual deposits of metalworking tools, weapons, and jewellery, suggesting that craftsmen regularly offered their finest work to secure Lugh's favour. The god's association with multiple skills, metalworking, poetry, warfare, and kingship reflected the Celtic ideal of excellence in all endeavours. Lugh's iconography, preserved in both archaeological finds and later literary sources, depicts him as a youthful, luminous figure carrying a spear that never missed its target and possessing a magical hound that could catch any quarry. Coins from Gaulish tribes frequently show a figure with radiating hair or a solar crown, likely representing Lugh in his aspect as a lightbringer. The festival of Lughnasadh, celebrated on August 1st, marked the beginning of the harvest season and featured competitions in craftsmanship, athletics, and poetry, all domains under Lugh's patronage. The god's connection to sovereignty appears throughout Celtic territories. In Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann could not achieve victory over their enemies until Lugh joined their assembly, demonstrating his role as the divine guarantor of legitimate rule. Gaulish coins bearing Lugh's image often accompanied inscriptions mentioning tribal kings, suggesting that rulers claimed divine sanction through association with the god. Archaeological evidence from hill forts across Celtic Europe reveals that sites associated with Lugh frequently contained royal residences, indicating his importance in legitimizing political authority. Brigid represents another deity whose worship transcended tribal boundaries, though her manifestations varied significantly across different Celtic regions. Known as Brigantia among the Brigantes of northern Britain, Brigindo in Gaul, and Bridget in Ireland, this goddess embodied the creative forces of poetry, smithcraft, and healing. The thermal springs at Bath contained hundreds of curse tablets and votive offerings addressed to Sulis Minerva, a Romano-Celtic synthesis that preserved Brigid's association with healing waters while incorporating Roman religious forms. Archaeological excavations at Brigid's sanctuary on Kildare reveal continuous occupation from the Iron Age through the early medieval period, with evidence of metalworking, textile production, and scribal activities. The site's perpetual flame, maintained by a succession of priestesses, appears to have pre-Christian origins based on the discovery of Iron Age hearths and ritual deposits of metalworking tools. The goddess's triple nature, manifesting as three sisters or aspects, appears in iconographic evidence from across Celtic territories, with triple-figured reliefs found at sites from Hadrian's Wall to the Rhine frontier. Brigid's patronage of poetry and learning positioned her as the divine inspiration behind the Celtic emphasis on oral tradition. The Philid, Ireland's hereditary poets, claimed descent from the goddess and underwent training that included memorizing vast collections of mythological material. Archaeological evidence from royal sites like Tara and Cú Chulainn shows that poets held privileged positions, with their quarters located near the king's hall and their graves containing luxury goods, typically reserved for warriors and nobles. The goddess's association with smithcraft appears throughout Celtic Europe in the form of ritual deposits of metalworking tools and weapons. At the Latene site itself, archaeologists discovered anvils, hammers and tongs that had been deliberately damaged before being cast into the lake, suggesting that smiths ritually killed their tools to dedicate them to Brigid. Similar practices occurred at Llyn Cerrig Bach in Wales, where hundreds of iron objects, many showing evidence of deliberate damage, were deposited in a lake over several centuries. Cernunnos, the horned god of nature and fertility, represents one of the most distinctive figures in the Celtic pantheon, his antlered form appearing in iconographic evidence from the 4th century BCE onward. The famous Gundestrup cauldron, discovered in a Danish bog but likely of Celtic manufacture, depicts Cernunnos seated in a cross-legged position, surrounded by animals and holding a torque and a serpent. This central image establishes the god's role as master of the wild, mediating between human civilization and the untamed natural world. Archaeological evidence for Cernunnos worship appears throughout Celtic territories, with particular concentrations in Gaul and Britain. The Pillar of the Boatmen, erected by Parisian sailors in the 1st century CE, shows Cernunnos alongside other Celtic and Roman deities, indicating his continued importance even under Roman rule. The god's association with fertility appears in numerous votive deposits of phallic symbols, animal figurines, and agricultural tools found at sites across Celtic Europe. The iconography of Cernunnos reveals complex symbolism relating to death and regeneration. His antlers, which naturally shed and regrow, symbolize the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. Archaeological evidence from ritual shafts at sites like Holzhausen in Bavaria shows that antlers were regularly deposited alongside human and animal remains, suggesting that Cernunnos presided over the transition between life and death. The god's cross-legged posture, reminiscent of meditation poses, may indicate his role as a guide for souls travelling between worlds. Regional variations in Cernunnos worship reflect local environmental conditions and cultural traditions. In forested areas of Gaul and Germany, the god appears more frequently in association with deer, boars and other woodland creatures. In the pastoral regions of Britain and Ireland, his iconography emphasises cattle and sheep, reflecting the economic importance of livestock. These regional adaptations demonstrate how Celtic deities evolved to meet the specific needs of different communities while maintaining their essential divine functions. The Gaulish pantheon included numerous deities known primarily through Roman sources and indigenous inscriptions. Tuatha, whose name means God of the tribe, appears in over 20 inscriptions from across Gaul, indicating widespread worship among Celtic communities. The Roman poet Lucan described Tuatha as receiving human sacrifices, though archaeological evidence suggests that such practices, if they occurred, were limited to specific ritual contexts. Votive inscriptions to Tuatha often accompanied dedications by military units, suggesting his role as a protector of warriors and tribal identity. Essus, another major Gaulish deity, appears in both literary sources and archaeological evidence. The Pillar of the Boatman depicts Essus as a woodcutter, wielding an axe among willow trees, while the Trier relief shows him cutting branches with the birds perched nearby. These images suggest Essus's association with vegetation, seasonal change, and perhaps sacrifice. Inscriptions to Essus appear primarily in northern Gaul, indicating regional concentration of his worship, though related deities with similar functions appear throughout Celtic territories. Taranis, the thunder god, commanded worship across Celtic Europe, his name appearing in inscriptions from Britain to the Balkans. Archaeological evidence includes numerous wheels and wheel-shaped amulets, symbols associated with the god's control over celestial phenomena. The Gundestrup cauldron shows a figure holding a wheel above a smaller human figure, likely representing Taranis' power over mortal affairs. Votive deposits of wheels in sacred springs and rivers throughout Celtic territories indicate that communities regularly sought the thunder god's protection through water-based offerings. The concept of divine sovereignty permeated Celtic religious thought, with specific deities tied to particular territories, rivers, and tribal boundaries. The matras, or mother goddesses, appear in hundreds of inscriptions and relief sculptures throughout Celtic Europe, typically shown as three-seated women holding fruits, bread, or infants. These deities embodied the fertility and protective power of specific localities, with their worship concentrated in areas where Celtic communities had established permanent settlements. River goddesses held particular importance in Celtic religious practice, with major waterways throughout Celtic territories bearing divine names. The Seine derived its name from Sequana, a goddess whose sanctuary at the river's source contained over 3,000 votive offerings, including wooden sculptures of pilgrims, anatomical models representing body parts seeking healing, and bronze figurines of the goddess herself. Similar sanctuaries existed at the sources of other major rivers, including the Saone, the Marne, and the Thames. The archaeological evidence from Sequana's sanctuary reveals the complexity of Celtic healing practices. Pilgrims travelled from across Gaul to seek the goddess's intervention, leaving offerings that included not only traditional Celtic items, but also Roman-style ex-votos, demonstrating the adaptability of Celtic religious practices. The wooden sculptures, preserved in the sanctuary's waterlogged conditions, show remarkable artistic skill and provide intimate glimpses into the concerns of ordinary Celtic people. Mothers seeking protection for their children, warriors hoping for healing from battle wounds, and farmers requesting favourable weather for their crops. Territorial deities extended beyond rivers to encompass entire landscapes and tribal regions. The Pennine goddess Brigantia protected the territory of the Brigantes, the largest tribe in Roman Britain, while Epona, the horse goddess, held particular significance among cavalry-oriented Celtic communities. Archaeological evidence for Epona's worship appears throughout Celtic Europe, with particular concentrations along the Rhine frontier where Celtic auxiliary cavalry units served in the Roman army. The multiplicity of divine functions characterized Celtic deities, with individual gods and goddesses embodying seemingly contradictory aspects of existence. Morrigan, the Irish war goddess, simultaneously represented battle fury and sovereignty, appearing both as a crow feeding on battlefield corpses and as a beautiful woman offering kingship to worthy heroes. Archaeological evidence from Irish royal sites includes numerous crow and raven bones in ritual deposits, suggesting that the goddess's avian associations had material expression in religious practice. The Welsh deity Manawydan embodied both the sea's destructive power and its role as a source of sustenance and trade. Archaeological evidence from coastal settlements in Wales reveals extensive ritual deposits of marine shells, fishing equipment, and imported goods, indicating that coastal communities regularly honoured sea deities through offerings. The god's association with craftsmanship appears in the preservation of specialised tools and workshop debris at sites associated with his worship. Celtic deities frequently crossed boundaries between life and death, serving as psychopomps who guided souls between worlds. The Gaulish god Dispater, mentioned by Caesar as the ancestor of all Gauls, appears in iconographic evidence as a bearded figure holding a hammer and accompanied by a dog, animals associated with the underworld in Celtic belief. Archaeological evidence from Celtic burial sites reveals that dogs were sometimes interred with their human companions, suggesting beliefs about their role in the afterlife journey. The integration of warfare and fertility in Celtic divine concepts reflects the culture's understanding of violence as a creative as well as destructive force. The Irish god Nuada, who lost his hand in battle and received a silver replacement, embodied the wounded king whose sacrifice ensured his people's prosperity. Archaeological evidence from Irish royal sites includes numerous deposits of weapons, alongside agricultural tools and fertility symbols, indicating that warfare and farming were understood as complementary aspects of divine activity. The preservation of Irish mythological traditions through medieval manuscripts provides the most comprehensive window into Celtic religious and cultural beliefs anywhere in Europe. 4 distinct narrative cycles emerged from centuries of oral tradition, each addressing different aspects of Irish identity, history, and cosmology. These cycles, the mythological, Ulster, Fenian, and historical, represent not merely entertainment but sophisticated attempts to understand the relationship between divine powers, heroic ideals, political legitimacy, and the natural world. The mythological cycle, anchored by the Lebor Gabála Érenn, presents a complex narrative of successive invasions that shaped Ireland's supernatural landscape. This pseudo-historical framework begins with Cessa, Noah's granddaughter, who allegedly arrived in Ireland 40 days before the biblical flood with 50 women and 3 men. Archaeological evidence cannot support such early settlement, but the narrative serves crucial mythological functions, establishing Ireland as a land touched by divine providence from the earliest times. The text describes 5 subsequent invasions, each bringing new peoples and supernatural elements to Ireland. Partholon's people, the first post-flood settlers, cleared 4 plains and created 7 lakes while battling the demonic Fomorians. The Numidians followed, establishing fortresses and fighting both Fomorians and internal conflicts that eventually forced their evacuation. The Firbolg, described as arriving in 230 ships, divided Ireland into 5 provinces and established the concept of provincial kingship that would dominate Irish political thought for centuries. The arrival of the Tuatha Dé Danann represents the cycle's mythological climax. These divine beings, whose name means people of the goddess Danu, brought 4 magical treasures from their northern cities: the Lia Fail from Phalias, which would cry out when touched by a rightful king; the Spear of Lugh from Gorias, which guaranteed victory in battle; the Sword of Nuada from Findias, from which no enemy could escape; and the Cauldron of the Dagda from Murias, which could feed any company without emptying. The Second Battle of Mag Tuired demonstrates the sophisticated theological concepts underlying Irish mythology. The Tuatha Dé Danann, representing order, craftsmanship, and divine kingship, confronted the Fomorians, embodying chaos, destruction, and primordial forces. The battle's outcome hinged not merely on military prowess, but on the proper relationship between divine authority and natural law. Nuada's disqualification from kingship due to his severed hand, a king must be physically perfect, and his eventual restoration through a silver replacement, crafted by the god-physician Dian Cecht, illustrates Celtic concepts of sacred kingship. Lugh's arrival at the Tuatha Dé Danann assembly exemplifies the mythological emphasis on skill and excellence. When challenged to demonstrate his worthiness, Lugh proved his mastery of every craft and art, earning the title Samildanacht. His tactical leadership during the battle, including the famous binding of Balor of the Evil Eye, established him as the divine prototype of the warrior king who combines physical prowess with intellectual superiority. The Dagda's role in the mythological cycle reveals the complexity of Celtic divine kingship. His intimate encounter with the Morrigan at the River Unius before the battle represents the sacred marriage between sovereignty and the land, ensuring fertility and victory. The Dagda's massive club, which could kill 9 men with one blow and revive them with the other end, symbolised the king's power over life and death. His inexhaustible cauldron provided the divine abundance that legitimate rulers were expected to distribute among their people. The eventual retreat of the Tuatha Dé Danann underground following the arrival of the Milesians established the ongoing relationship between the visible world and the otherworld. The Tuatha Dé Danann became the Aosc, dwelling in Sidhe scattered across the Irish landscape. This transformation from gods to fairy folk reflects the adaptation of pre-Christian beliefs to new religious contexts, while maintaining their essential functions as guardians of the land and sources of supernatural power. The Ulster cycle centres on the court of Conchobar mac Nessa de Main Macha and the heroic deeds of Cú Chulainn, whose exploits embody the warrior ideals of early Irish society. The Tain Bo Cuailnge serves as the cycle's central narrative, describing Queen Medbu of Connaught's attempt to steal the brown bull of Cooley to match her husband's prized white bull of Connaught. This seemingly simple plot encompasses complex themes of honour, territorial sovereignty, and the relationship between individual heroism and collective identity. The Tain begins with a pillow talk between Medba and her husband Ailill, during which they compare their respective wealth and discover that Ailill's white bull gives him slight superiority. Medba's determination to acquire the brown bull of Cooley reflects not mere acquisitiveness, but the Celtic understanding of cattle as symbols of royal power and territorial control. Archaeological evidence from Iron Age Ireland reveals that cattle formed the basis of wealth measurement and legal compensation, making the bull's symbolic significance economically grounded. Cú Chulainn's single-handed defence of Ulster against Medby's invasion demonstrates the heroic ideal of the individual warrior, whose prowess transcends normal human limitations. The hero's Ríastrad, a supernatural battle fury that transformed him into a terrifying figure with reversed hair, bulging eyes and protruding muscles, represents the liminal state between human and divine that characterized Celtic warrior culture. His use of the Gae Bolga, a barbed spear that could only be thrown with the foot and created 30 wounds in its victim's body, established him as master of exotic weapons and fighting techniques. The single combat between Cú Chulainn and his foster brother Ferdiad illustrates the tragic dimensions of heroic culture. Their 3-day battle, fought at a ford while their respective armies watched, demonstrates the formal nature of Celtic warfare and the importance of personal honour over political advantage. Each evening the warriors shared food and healing herbs, maintaining their friendship even while trying to kill each other. Ferdiad's death, pierced by the Gae Bolga after Cú Chulainn's feigned retreat, represents the ultimate cost of heroic ideals. The Ulster warriors' debility during the Táin, caused by Macha's curse that they would suffer labour pains in times of greatest need, reflects mythological explanations for military defeats and the cyclical nature of power. Only Cú Chulainn, born of the divine parentage through Lugh, remained unaffected by the curse, emphasising his role as the bridge between human and divine realms. The curse's eventual lifting coincided with the arrival of reinforcements, suggesting that divine intervention operated through natural as well as supernatural means. The death of Cú Chulainn in later Ulster cycle tales demonstrates the inevitable fate of heroes who transgress social boundaries. His violation of multiple geasa, eating dog meat despite his name meaning Hound of Chulainn, accepting hospitality from enemies and fighting while wounded, led to his death at the hands of Lugh Macon Roy. The hero's final act of tying himself to a standing stone so he could die on his feet while facing his enemies established the heroic ideal of maintaining dignity even in defeat. The Fenian cycle, centred on Finn mac Cumhaill and the Fianna, presents a different model of heroic society based on voluntary association rather than tribal loyalty. The Fianna operated as a professional warrior band that served the High King of Ireland while maintaining independence from local political structures. Their members, drawn from throughout Ireland, underwent rigorous testing that included composing poetry, memorising traditional tales, and demonstrating exceptional physical prowess. Finn's acquisition of wisdom through eating the salmon of knowledge establishes his role as both warrior and sage. The salmon, which had fed on hazelnuts from the well of wisdom, contained all knowledge of the world. When Finn accidentally burned his thumb while cooking the fish for his master, the druid finisses, and sucked the burn, he gained the salmon's wisdom. Throughout the cycle, Finn's supernatural knowledge, accessed by sucking his thumb, provides solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The Fianna's seasonal lifestyle reflected their liminal position between civilization and wilderness. During winter months, they lived in the houses of nobles who were obligated to provide hospitality. From Beltane to Samhain, they lived outdoors, hunting, patrolling borders, and maintaining their fighting skills. This alternation between domestic and wild existence symbolized their role as mediators between settled society and the untamed forces of nature. The cycle's emphasis on loyalty and honor appears throughout tales of the Fianna's adventures. The story of Diarmid and Grania illustrates the conflict between personal desire and social obligation. When Grania, betrothed to the aging Finn, placed a geas on Diarmid to elope with her, the young warrior faced an impossible choice between loyalty to his leader and compliance with magical compulsion. Their flight across Ireland, pursued by Finn and the Fianna, demonstrates the geographic scope of Fenian activities and the inescapable nature of fate. The Fianna's hunting expeditions reveal their intimate relationship with the natural world. Their ability to track quarry across vast distances, communicate with animals, and survive in wilderness conditions established them as masters of the untamed landscape. The cycle's frequent references to specific geographic locations, mountains, rivers, forests, and plains, created a mythological map of Ireland that connected legendary events to recognisable landmarks. Finn's relationship with the Otherworld appears in numerous tales involving supernatural women, fairy mounds, and magical transformations. His encounter with Sadeby, who had been transformed into a deer by a druid's curse, resulted in the birth of Oisin, the greatest poet among the Fianna. The story of Niamh of the Golden Hair, who took Oisin to Tir na Nog, explores themes of eternal youth, the passage of time, and the inevitable separation between mortal and immortal realms. The historical cycle, also known as the Cycle of the Kings, blends mythological elements with pseudo-historical narratives about semi-legendary rulers of Ireland. These tales, while claiming historical authenticity, incorporate supernatural elements that reveal their mythological origins. The cycle's primary function was to legitimize contemporary political arrangements by connecting ruling dynasties to heroic ancestors and divine sanction. The Tainbo Flidais exemplifies the cycle's approach to pseudo-history. Set during the reign of Cairbre ní Fair, The tale describes supernatural cattle that could feed entire armies and a divine woman whose favours determined military success. The story's political implications, establishing the superiority of certain tribal groups over others, demonstrate how mythological narratives served contemporary political purposes. The cycle's treatment of the Connaughta kings illustrates the complex relationship between mythological and historical elements. Conn of the 100 Battles, allegedly the ancestor of numerous Irish dynasties, appears in tales that combine recognisable historical details with clearly mythological episodes. His encounter with Lugh at Tara, during which the god revealed the future kings of Ireland, provides divine validation for dynastic claims while incorporating authentic details about royal inauguration ceremonies. The story of Niall of the Nine Hostages demonstrates the cycle's sophisticated approach to political legitimacy. Niall's recognition as rightful king through his willingness to kiss a hideous hag, who then transformed into a beautiful woman representing sovereignty, incorporates ancient Celtic beliefs about the sacred marriage between king and land. The tale's emphasis on Niall's generosity, justice, and military prowess establishes the ideal qualities expected of legitimate rulers. The cycle's treatment of the Lagan kings reveals regional variations in mythological traditions. The tale of Labraid Loingsech, who conquered Ireland with foreign allies, reflects historical memories of population movements and political upheavals, while incorporating supernatural elements such as his horse's ears and his ability to understand all languages. These mythological additions transform potentially mundane political events into narratives of cosmic significance. The historical cycle's emphasis on genealogy reflects the importance of lineage in Irish society. The cycle's detailed accounts of royal ancestors, their marriages, alliances, and conflicts provided the framework for understanding contemporary political relationships. The mythological elements embedded in these genealogies, divine ancestors, supernatural births, prophetic dreams, elevated political history to the level of sacred narrative. The four cycles' interaction with each other reveals the sophisticated nature of Irish mythological thought. Characters from one cycle frequently appear in others, creating a complex web of relationships that spans both mythological and historical time. The Tuatha Dé Danann continue to influence events in the Ulster and Fenian cycles, while heroes from earlier periods appear as ancestors or inspirations for later figures. The cycle's treatment of landscape demonstrates their function as repositories of cultural memory. Specific locations throughout Ireland became associated with particular mythological events, creating a sacred geography that connected communities to their legendary past. The Battle of Moytura was located at specific sites in County Sligo, while the Taine's route across Ireland can still be traced through surviving place names and archaeological features. The preservation of these cycles through medieval manuscripts reflects the continued importance of mythological knowledge in Irish society. Scribes, many of them monks, carefully recorded oral traditions that had been transmitted for centuries, often adding Christian interpretations while preserving essential mythological content. The resulting texts provide invaluable insights into pre-Christian Irish beliefs and their adaptation to new religious contexts. The Welsh mythological tradition preserved in the Mabinogion represents one of the most sophisticated collections of Celtic narrative material to survive from medieval Europe. These tales, compiled primarily from 12th and 13th century manuscripts including the White Book of Ríastrad and the Red Book of Hergest, preserve oral traditions that extend back to the early medieval period and beyond. Unlike the Irish cycles, which were organised around specific heroic periods, the Welsh material demonstrates a more complex relationship between mythological time and historical memory, with stories set in both the distant past and the recognisable world of medieval Wales. The 4 branches of the Mabinogi, Pwyll, Branwen, Manawydan and Math form the collection's narrative core, presenting interconnected tales that explore fundamental themes of sovereignty, honour, and the relationship between mortal and supernatural realms. These stories demonstrate remarkable literary sophistication, employing complex narrative structures, psychological depth, and symbolic richness that suggests their origins in highly developed oral traditions maintained by professional storytellers. The first branch, Pwyll Prince of Dyfed, establishes the framework for understanding Welsh concepts of otherworldly interaction and legitimate authority. The tale begins with Pwyll's encounter with Arawn, King of Annan, during a hunting expedition in Glyn Cwch. Pwyll's initial discourtesy in claiming Arawn's kill leads to a year-long exchange of identities, during which Pwyll rules Annan while Arawn governs Dyfed. This supernatural arrangement tests both rulers' honour and establishes the principle that legitimate authority requires moral integrity as well as political power. The exchange reveals sophisticated concepts about the nature of kingship and identity. Pwyll's successful governance of Annan, including his defeat of Arawn's enemy Hafgan, demonstrates that royal authority transcends mere physical presence. His restraint in not sleeping with Arawn's wife during their year-long deception establishes the crucial importance of sexual honour in maintaining legitimate rule. The mutual satisfaction of both kings with their substitute's performance suggests that true kingship involves embodying ideal qualities rather than simply occupying a throne. Pwyll's acquisition of the title Pen Annan through this adventure establishes his unique position as a mortal ruler with authority in the Otherworld. This dual sovereignty becomes crucial in his subsequent marriage to Rhiannon, a supernatural woman whose origins clearly lie in the Otherworld. Her initial appearance, riding a white horse that no earthly mount could overtake despite its seemingly leisurely pace, demonstrates the deceptive nature of otherworldly manifestations and the futility of pursuing supernatural beings through conventional means. The courtship of Rhiannon reveals the complex protocols governing relationships between mortal and supernatural beings. Pwyll's patient waiting at the Mound of Arbeth, a location specifically associated with otherworldly manifestations, demonstrates the proper approach to supernatural encounters. His direct address to Rhiannon when she finally responds to his call establishes the importance of honest communication in otherworldly relationships. The revelation that she'd been seeking him specifically, having rejected her intended marriage to Gwawl Fab Clwyd, indicates that supernatural beings possess agency and preferences that must be respected. The wedding feast incident, where Pwyll's careless promise to grant any request allows Gwawl to claim Rhiannon, illustrates the dangerous precision required in supernatural negotiations. Words carry binding power in otherworldly contexts, and Pwyll's generous but thoughtless response nearly costs him his bride. Rhiannon's clever stratagem, involving a magical bag that cannot be filled, and Pwyll's humiliation of Gwawl, demonstrates the necessity of wit and cunning in resolving supernatural complications. The birth and disappearance of Pryderi introduces themes of loss, transformation and restoration that permeate Welsh mythology. The infant's mysterious vanishing on the night of his birth, coinciding with the slaughter of Rhiannon's horses, creates a supernatural crisis that threatens both the royal succession and the Queen's reputation. The accusation that Rhiannon murdered and devoured her own child reflects ancient beliefs about the dangerous nature of supernatural women and the potential for otherworldly beings to revert to monstrous behaviour. Rhiannon's punishment, carrying visitors to the court on her back like a horse, explicitly connects her to her equine associations. while demonstrating the consequences of supernatural transgression. The punishment's public nature serves multiple functions. It maintains social order by punishing alleged infanticide, it humiliates the supernatural queen by reducing her to bestial status, and it provides a visible reminder of the dangers inherent in otherworldly marriages. The parallel story of Tiernan Tuatha Mare reveals the interconnected nature of supernatural events. The annual loss of the mare's foal on May Eve, coinciding with Praederi's disappearance, suggests that otherworldly forces operate according to specific temporal patterns. Tiernan's successful defense of his mare against the monstrous claw that emerges from the darkness demonstrates that mortal courage and vigilance can overcome supernatural threats. His discovery of the infant outside his house, immediately after wounding the creature, establishes the connection between the two mysteries. The child's rapid growth and exceptional abilities mark him as a figure of supernatural origin. His early mastery of horses, exceptional strength, and noble bearing identify him as more than merely human. The recognition of his resemblance to Pwyll, combined with the timing of his appearance, leads to his identification as the missing prince. The restoration of Praederi to his parents resolves the supernatural crisis while establishing his unique position as a figure who bridges mortal and otherworldly realms. The second branch, Branwen, daughter of Lugh, presents a more complex narrative structure that encompasses themes of international diplomacy, family honour, and the catastrophic consequences of wounded pride. The tale begins with the arrival of Matholwch, King of Ireland, seeking marriage with Branwen to cement an alliance between Ireland and the Island of the Mighty. The initial negotiations, conducted with appropriate ceremony and mutual respect, establish the proper protocols for royal marriages between different kingdoms. The intervention of Efnisien, Branwen's half-brother, transforms a diplomatic triumph into a potential disaster. His mutilation of Matholwch's horses, cutting off their lips, ears and tails, represents not merely vandalism but a deliberate insult to Irish sovereignty. Horses held particular significance in Celtic royal symbolism, and their disfigurement constituted an attack on Matholwch's dignity as a king. Efnisien's motivation, his anger at not being consulted about his sister's marriage, reflects the complex kinship obligations that governed Celtic society. Bendigeidfran's compensation for the insult demonstrates the elaborate protocols required to restore honour after supernatural or political transgression. The replacement horses, the silver staff, and the golden plate represent standard diplomatic compensation, but the addition of the Cauldron of Rebirth elevates the settlement to supernatural significance. This magical vessel, which could restore slain warriors to life, represents one of the 13 treasures of Britain and establishes the extraordinary value placed on maintaining the Irish alliance. The cauldron's history, revealed through Bendigeidfran's account of the giant Lasser Las Gifnuid and his wife Chimide Siminfol, demonstrates the complex circulation of magical objects between Britain and Ireland. The giants' escape from the Iron House in Ireland, where they had been imprisoned and nearly burned alive, establishes a pattern of supernatural exile and return that will be repeated throughout the tale. Their gratitude to Bendigeidfran for providing sanctuary results in the gift of the cauldron, creating the obligation that leads to its transfer to Matholwch. Branwen's initial happiness in Ireland, where she bears a son named Gwern and enjoys royal status, contrasts sharply with her subsequent degradation. The Irish court's delayed reaction to the horse mutilation, influenced by murmuring about the inadequacy of Matholwch's response, demonstrates how public opinion can override royal decisions. Branwen's reduction to kitchen servant status, her daily beating by the butcher, and the prohibition on travel between Ireland and Britain reveal the systematic nature of her humiliation. The train starling that carries Branwen's message to her brother, represents one of the most sophisticated examples of animal communication in Celtic literature. The bird's ability to understand human speech, memorize complex messages, and navigate between kingdoms establishes the connection between supernatural communication and the natural world. Branwen's location of the bird, her patient training, and her composition of the letter demonstrate her resourcefulness and determination despite her degraded circumstances. Bendigeidfran's response to his sister's plight reveals the obligations of kinship and the escalating nature of honour conflicts. His decision to invade Ireland personally, wading across the Irish Sea with his fleet following, establishes his supernatural stature and the seriousness of his commitment. The famous declaration that he himself would be the bridge for his army when they encounter the River Linnon demonstrates both his literal ability to span waterways and his metaphorical role as the connection between his people and their objective. The Irish strategy of retreating across the river and destroying the bridge forces Bendigeidfran to fulfill his promise literally. His transformation into a bridge, with his army marching across his body, represents one of the most striking images in Celtic literature. This act of self-sacrifice for military necessity establishes the king's willingness to subordinate personal dignity to collective needs while demonstrating his supernatural nature. The Irish attempt at reconciliation through the construction of a house large enough to contain Bendigeidfran reveals the continued importance of hospitality protocols even during warfare. The building's unprecedented size, necessary to accommodate the British giant king, represents a significant investment in diplomatic resolution. However, the concealment of armed warriors in leather bags hanging from the house's pillars transforms the peace offering into a trap. Efnisien's discovery and elimination of the hidden warriors demonstrates his value as a suspicious and violent guardian of British interests. His systematic crushing of each warrior's head through the leather bags, accomplished by feeling for the hardest part of each body, reveals both his supernatural strength and his ruthless efficiency. The sole survivor, whose head he crushes twice before succeeding, establishes the limits of even supernatural violence. The feast that follows represents the last attempt at peaceful resolution. The presentation of young Gwern, Branwen's son, as the heir to Ireland offers a potential solution that would unite the kingdoms through dynastic succession. The child's acceptance by both sides, demonstrated by his willingness to go to each warrior in turn, suggests that innocence might overcome the accumulated grievances between the nations. Efnisien's sudden seizure and murder of Gwern, throwing the child into the fire, represents the triumph of destructive impulses over diplomatic solutions. This act of infanticide, committed against his own nephew, transforms the feast into a battlefield and ensures that no peaceful resolution remains possible. The child's death eliminates the potential for dynastic unity, while demonstrating the ultimate consequences of uncontrolled violence. The battle that follows consumes both armies, with the Irish advantage of the Cauldron of Rebirth initially proving decisive. The resurrection of Irish warriors, though they return speechless, provides a continuous supply of fighters that threatens to overwhelm the British forces. Efnisien's recognition of the Cauldron's role in Irish success leads to his final act of self-sacrifice, concealing himself among the Irish dead to gain access to the magical vessel. Efnisien's destruction of the Cauldron through internal pressure, bursting his own heart in the process, represents both redemption for his earlier destructive acts and the ultimate sacrifice required to achieve victory. His death eliminates the Irish advantage while demonstrating that supernatural objects can be destroyed through supernatural means. The Cauldron's destruction ensures that the battle's outcome will depend on conventional military factors rather than magical intervention. The mutual annihilation of both armies, leaving only 7 British survivors and no Irish survivors except 5 pregnant women hidden in a cave, establishes the catastrophic consequences of honour conflicts that escalate beyond diplomatic resolution. Bendigeidfran's mortal wound from a poisoned spear, despite his supernatural nature, demonstrates that even divine figures face consequences for their actions. His command to decapitate him and carry his head to London establishes the continuing protection he will provide even after death. The third branch, Manawydan, son of Lir, continues the narrative through the perspective of one of the 7 survivors from Ireland. Manawydan's return to Britain, his discovery that his lands have been usurped during his absence, and his decision to accept dispossession rather than fight for his inheritance, establish him as a figure of wisdom and restraint. His marriage to Rhiannon, now widowed by Pwyll's death, creates a new alliance that bridges the gap between the supernatural and mortal realms. The mysterious enchantment that transforms Dyfed into a wasteland represents one of the most sophisticated supernatural threats in Celtic literature. The disappearance of all inhabitants except the 4 protagonists, Manawydan, Rhiannon, Pryderi, and his wife Sigfa, creates a landscape of supernatural desolation that challenges their survival skills and moral integrity. The preservation of livestock and buildings, while eliminating human presence, suggests a selective curse designed to test specific individuals. Manawydan's response to the enchantment demonstrates practical wisdom and adaptability. His successive attempts at different livelihoods, farming, shoemaking and shield-making, establish his versatility and determination. The hostility he encounters from established craftsmen in English towns, who resent his superior skills and competitive pricing, reflects realistic economic concerns while advancing the narrative toward its supernatural resolution. The appearance of the mysterious fortress on land where none had existed before presents the protagonists with a supernatural challenge that tests their wisdom and restraint. Manawydan's warning against entering the fortress demonstrates his understanding of otherworldly dangers, while Pryderi's impulsive entry establishes the consequences of ignoring supernatural warnings. The golden bowl that adheres to Pryderi's hands, preventing his speech or movement, represents a classic otherworldly trap that punishes curiosity and greed. Rhiannon's decision to follow her son into the fortress, despite Manawydan's warnings and her own supernatural knowledge, demonstrates the power of maternal love over practical wisdom. Her similar entrapment by the Golden Bowl creates a double crisis that tests Manawydan's loyalty and resourcefulness. The disappearance of the fortress with both captives inside establishes the otherworldly nature of the threat and the need for supernatural solutions. The revelation that the enchantment stems from Lluyd fab Cilcoed's revenge for Gwol fab Clwyd's humiliation in the first branch demonstrates the long-term consequences of supernatural conflicts. Lluyd's systematic punishment of Pwyll's family and territory through magical means establishes the interconnected nature of the 4 branches and the persistence of otherworldly grievances. The elaborate nature of the revenge, transforming Lluyd's court into mice to destroy Manawydan's crops, reveals the creativity and persistence of supernatural vengeance. Manawydan's capture of the pregnant mouse, his construction of a miniature gallows, and his insistence on proper execution procedures create a scene of comic absurdity that masks serious supernatural negotiations. The successive attempts to ransom the mouse, first by a scholar, then by a priest, then by a bishop, establish the escalating value of the captive while maintaining the pretense of normal legal proceedings. Manawydan's refusal of increasingly generous offers demonstrates his understanding that supernatural negotiations require different currencies than material exchanges. The revelation of the bishop's true identity as Lluyd fab Cilcoed and the mouse's identity as his pregnant wife transforms the comic scene into serious supernatural diplomacy. The negotiations that follow establish the terms for ending the enchantment, the restoration of Rhiannon and Pryderi, the lifting of the curse on Dyfed, and the guarantee that no further revenge will be taken. Manawyddan's insistence on comprehensive terms demonstrates his experience with supernatural contracts and the importance of precise language in otherworldly negotiations. The fourth branch, Mathson of Mathenwy, presents the most complex and morally ambiguous of the four branches, exploring themes of intimate transgression, magical transformation, and the abuse of supernatural power. Math's peculiar requirement that his feet rest in a virgin's lap, except during times of war, establishes the intimate tensions that drive the narrative while suggesting connections between royal power and purity. The role of Gowyn, the virgin footholder, creates a position of intimate service that becomes the focus of the tale's central conflict. The brothers Gylfaethwy and Gwydion, Math's nephews and heirs, represent contrasting approaches to desire and power. Gylfaethwy's obsessive love for Gowyn, which causes him to waste away with unfulfilled desire, establishes the destructive power of intimate frustration. Gwydion's willingness to engineer a war between Math's kingdom and Pryderi's territory in order to remove Math from court demonstrates the lengths to which supernatural beings will go to satisfy their desires. The theft of Pryderi's swine through Gwydion's magical trickery reveals the sophisticated nature of otherworldly deception. Gwydion's transformation of mushrooms into horses and hounds, his creation of illusory armour and weapons, and his establishment of false identities for himself and his companions demonstrate the creative potential of shape-shifting magic. The temporary nature of these transformations, which will revert to their original forms within a day, creates urgency that drives Pryderi's hasty decision-making. The single combat between Gwydion and Pryderi, arranged to resolve the conflict over the swine, establishes the connection between magical power and martial prowess. Gwydion's victory through superior magic rather than physical strength demonstrates that supernatural abilities provide decisive advantages in combat. Pryderi's death eliminates a major figure from the first branch, while establishing Gwydion's reputation as a dangerous opponent. The brothers' violation of Gowyn during Math's absence represents the tale's moral nadir and establishes the consequences of uncontrolled desire. The violation of the virgin footholder constitutes not merely an assault but an attack on the magical foundations of Math's power. Gowyn's immediate report to Math upon his return demonstrates her courage and establishes the king's obligation to punish the transgression. Math's punishment of his nephews through transformation into breeding pairs of animals represents one of the most elaborate examples of magical justice in Celtic literature. The successive transformations, deer, swine, and wolves, force the brothers to experience sexuality from multiple perspectives while producing offspring that demonstrate their fertility. The restoration of Gylfaethwy and Gwydion to human form after 3 years of animal existence, accompanied by their 3 transformed children, demonstrates the potential for redemption through suffering. The children's transformation into noble youths named Haidun, Hichdun, and Blaidwen preserves the consequences of their parents' punishment while integrating them into human society. Math's acceptance of the transformed brothers back into his service establishes the possibility of forgiveness after appropriate punishment. The search for a new virgin footholder leads to the introduction of Arianrhod, whose failed virginity test creates new complications. Her immediate birth of 2 children upon stepping over Math's magic wand, Dylan, who immediately returns to the sea, and an unnamed infant who is secretly rescued by Gwydion, establishes her as a figure of supernatural fertility, despite her claims of virginity. Dylan's instant adaptation to marine life, swimming as well as any fish, suggests his divine nature and connection to otherworldly realms. Gwydion's secret raising of the unnamed child, who grows at supernatural speed and demonstrates exceptional abilities, creates a new focus for the narrative. The child's rapid development, his early mastery of weapons and horses, and his exceptional beauty mark him as a figure of supernatural origin. Gwydion's decision to present the child to Arianrhod as her son creates the conflict that drives the remainder of the tale. Arianrhod's threefold curse on her unwanted son, that he will have no name unless she gives him one, no weapons unless she arms him, and no human wife, establishes the obstacles that must be overcome through magical means. Each curse reflects different aspects of Celtic social identity. The name that establishes lineage and identity, the weapons that mark adult male status, and the wife who ensures continuation of the bloodline. The systematic nature of these curses suggests their origin in ancient ritual formulas for social exclusion. Gwydion's elaborate deceptions to overcome each curse demonstrate the power of magical illusion and the persistence of supernatural guardianship. His transformation of himself and the boy into shoemakers, his creation of illusory ships and armies, and his impersonation of bards establish his mastery of multiple magical disciplines. The successful extraction of the name Lugh gifts and the acquisition of weapons through trickery demonstrate that supernatural curses can be overcome through superior magical skill. The creation of Blodeuwedd from flowers to serve as Lugh's wife represents the ultimate expression of magical craftsmanship. Math and Gwydion's collaboration in forming a woman from oak, broom, and meadowsweet blossoms creates a being of supernatural beauty and fertility who can circumvent Arianrhod's curse through her non-human origin. The choice of flowers, oak for strength, broom for humility, and meadowsweet for sweetness suggests careful attention to the symbolic properties of the materials used. Blodeuwedd's adultery with Gronupebba and their conspiracy to murder Lugh represents the inevitable consequences of creating life through magical means without addressing its emotional and moral dimensions. Her betrayal of her husband through infidelity and attempted murder demonstrates that artificial creation cannot guarantee loyalty or affection. The Celtic understanding of reality encompassed multiple interconnected dimensions, with the physical landscape serving as both a practical living space and a sacred geography where supernatural forces manifested through specific locations. Archaeological evidence from across Celtic territories reveals that certain landscape features, burial mounds, stone circles, springs, and groves, functioned as portals between the mortal world and the otherworld, creating a network of sacred sites that structured both religious practice and political authority. The Sid Mounds of Ireland represent perhaps the most extensively documented examples of otherworldly gateways in Celtic tradition. These Neolithic passage tombs, constructed between 3200 and 2500 BCE, were reinterpreted by Celtic peoples as dwelling places of the Tuatha Dé Danann following their retreat from the surface world. Archaeological investigations at sites like Newgrange, Noath, and Douth reveal continuous ritual activity from the Bronze Age through the early medieval period, indicating that these monuments maintained their sacred significance across multiple cultural transitions. The Brunabuan complex demonstrates the sophisticated astronomical alignments that characterize these otherworldly portals. Newgrange's passage tomb, oriented to capture the winter solstice sunrise, creates a dramatic illumination of the inner chamber that transforms the dark burial space into a realm of light. The 19-meter passage, lined with massive orthostats decorated with spiral and diamond motifs, creates a ritual journey from the external world into the heart of the otherworld. The chamber's corbelled roof, rising 6 meters above the floor, creates an acoustic environment where even whispered words resonate with supernatural intensity. Excavations within Newgrange have revealed cremated human remains, stone basins, and ritual deposits that span over 3,000 years of use. The discovery of Roman coins, medieval artifacts, and early Christian crosses carved into the monument stones indicates that successive cultures recognised its otherworldly significance. The medieval Irish texts that describe Newgrange as the Cid of Engusog, the god of love and poetry, preserve authentic traditions about the site's supernatural associations while adapting them to contemporary religious frameworks. The Noath complex, containing the largest passage tomb in Ireland surrounded by 17 smaller satellite tombs, reveals the hierarchical organisation of otherworldly spaces. The main tomb's 2 passages, oriented east-west to capture the equinox sunrises and sunsets, create a cosmic axis that connects the monument to the annual cycle of solar movement. The site's 300 decorated stones, featuring the largest collection of megalithic art in Europe, include spirals, circles, and serpentine forms that may represent maps of otherworldly territories or ritual instructions for spiritual journeys. Stone circles throughout Celtic territories functioned as sacred enclosures where communities gathered for seasonal festivals and otherworldly communication. The Avebury complex in Wiltshire, encompassing 28 acres within its massive stone circle, represents the largest such monument in Britain. The circle's 98 surviving stones, some weighing over 40 tons, create a sacred boundary that separates ritual space from the mundane world. Archaeological evidence indicates that the monument's construction required coordinated labour from multiple communities, suggesting its importance as a regional centre for otherworldly activities. The circle's internal features reveal the complexity of Celtic sacred architecture. The 2 smaller circles within the main enclosure, each containing central stone settings, create multiple focal points for ritual activities. The discovery of deliberately buried stones, human remains, and ritual deposits throughout the site indicates that the monument served as a location for complex ceremonies involving death, transformation, and otherworldly communication. The causeway that connects Avebury to the sanctuary on Overton Hill creates a processional route that may have been used for seasonal festivals or initiation ceremonies. Stonehenge's evolution from a simple earthwork to a complex stone monument reflects changing Celtic concepts of otherworldly architecture. The monument's final phase, featuring the iconic trilathon circle and horseshoe arrangement, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of astronomical alignments and acoustic properties. The blue stones, transported from Wales over 150 miles away, indicate that specific types of stone held particular significance in otherworldly construction. The monument's alignment with the summer and winter solstices creates a cosmic calendar that connects earthly time with otherworldly rhythms. Sacred groves represented another crucial category of otherworldly gateways, though their organic nature means that archaeological evidence remains limited. Classical authors like Pliny and Tacitus describe Celtic groves as places of human sacrifice and divine revelation, though these accounts likely reflect Roman propaganda rather than accurate ethnographic observation. The persistence of grove names in Celtic territories, Derry in Ireland, Vernametum in Britain, indicates the widespread importance of these sacred spaces. The archaeological site of Gournay-sur-Aronde in northern France provides evidence for the material culture associated with sacred groves. The rectangular enclosure, measuring 45 by 38 metres, contained a central pit where thousands of animal bones, weapons, and ritual objects were deposited over 4 centuries. The site's wooden structures, reconstructed from post-hole evidence, suggest that groves were not simply natural spaces but carefully managed sacred precincts with built elements for ritual activities. Water held particular significance in Celtic otherworldly geography, with springs, rivers and lakes serving as both practical resources and supernatural boundaries. The thermal springs at Bath demonstrate the elaborate ritual complexes that developed around sacred water sources. The Roman period temple, built over earlier Celtic sacred sites, contained over 12,000 coins and hundreds of curse tablets thrown into the sacred spring as offerings to the goddess Sulis. The tablets, written in Latin but following Celtic legal formulas, reveal the continuity of indigenous beliefs about water's power to transmit messages to otherworldly beings. The ritual deposits at Lyn Cerrig Bach on Anglesey illustrate the widespread Celtic practice of making offerings to water deities. Between 300 BCE and 60 CE, communities deposited over 150 iron objects in the lake, including weapons, tools, slave chains, and vehicle fittings. Many items showed evidence of deliberate damage before deposition, suggesting ritual killing to release their spiritual essence for otherworldly use. The discovery of human and animal bones alongside the metalwork indicates that water offerings sometimes included living sacrifices. Rivers throughout Celtic territories bore divine names that reflected their supernatural significance. The Seine, Thames, and Severn were understood as goddesses whose favour ensured safe passage, abundant fish, and fertile lands. The sanctuary of Sequana at the Seine's source contained over 3,000 votive offerings, including wooden sculptures of pilgrims, bronze figurines of the goddess, and anatomical models representing body parts seeking healing. The pilgrimage routes that converged on the sanctuary, marked by way stations and subsidiary shrines, created a sacred geography centered on the river's divine source. Islands held special significance as otherworldly locations, their natural boundaries creating liminal spaces between the mortal world and supernatural realms. The island of Anglesey served as the centre of British druidical education, according to Caesar's account, with students travelling from across Celtic territories to study on the sacred island. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lyn Cerrig Bach and Bryn Celli DDU confirms the island's exceptional concentration of ritual activity and otherworldly monuments. The concept of Tir na Nog in Irish tradition represents the ultimate otherworldly realm, accessible through specific landscape features or supernatural invitation. This timeless land, where aging ceased and death held no power, could be reached through Sid mounds, sacred islands, or underwater passages. The story of Oisin's journey to Tir na Nog with Niamh of the golden hair illustrates the temporal distortions that characterized otherworldly travel. What seemed like 3 years in the land of the young proved to be 3 centuries in the mortal world. Magmel represented another otherworldly realm, characterized by abundance, beauty, and eternal pleasure. Unlike Tir na Nog, which emphasized timelessness, Magmel focused on sensory gratification and material abundance. The realm's location across the Western Sea, accessible through magical boats or supernatural guides, connected it to the daily cycle of solar movement and the annual pattern of seasonal change. The description of Magmel's silver-branched trees, crystal streams, and honey-flowing rivers created a landscape of supernatural fertility that contrasted sharply with the hardships of mortal existence. The Welsh otherworld of Annan, ruled by Arawn and later associated with Gwyn ap Nudd, represented a more complex supernatural realm that encompassed both paradisiacal and threatening aspects. Annan's location beneath the earth, accessible through caves, burial mounds, and other subterranean passages, connected it to the realm of the dead while maintaining its function as a source of otherworldly power. The Cauldron of Rebirth, one of the 13 treasures of Britain, originated in Annan and demonstrated the realm's power over life and death. Seasonal festivals created temporal gateways that allowed increased communication between mortal and otherworldly realms. These celebrations, timed to coincide with astronomical events and agricultural cycles, represented moments when the veil between worlds grew thin and supernatural beings could more easily interact with human communities. The four major festivals, Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane and Lugh, structured the Celtic year around these periods of otherworldly accessibility. Samhain, marking the transition from summer to winter on November 1st, represented the most significant otherworldly opening in the Celtic calendar. Archaeological evidence from hill forts and royal sites indicates that communities gathered for elaborate feasts that combined ancestor veneration with supernatural communication. The festival's association with the dead, reflected in the modern celebration of Halloween, preserves authentic Celtic beliefs about the increased presence of otherworldly beings during the dark half of the year. The lighting of bonfires during Samhain served multiple functions in otherworldly communication. The fires provided protection against malevolent spirits, while creating beacons that guided beneficial supernatural beings to human settlements. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tara and Navan Fort reveals large fire pits that were used repeatedly during the late autumn period, suggesting institutionalized bonfire lighting as part of royal ceremonial obligations. The practice of extinguishing all hearth fires and relighting them from the sacred Samhain fire created a symbolic renewal that connected individual households to the otherworldly power channeled through royal authority. Divination practices during Samhain exploited the festival's otherworldly openings to gain knowledge of future events. The use of apples, nuts, and other seasonal foods in fortune-telling reflected the belief that otherworldly beings could communicate through natural symbols. The practice of leaving food offerings for supernatural visitors, preserved in the modern tradition of trick-or-treating, acknowledged the festival's role in maintaining positive relationships with otherworldly powers. Imbolc, celebrated on February 1st, marked the beginning of spring and the return of fertility to the land. The festival's association with Brigid, goddess of fire, smithcraft and poetry, connected it to the creative forces that emerged from winter's dormancy. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Brigid reveals continuous ritual activity during the early spring period, including the lighting of perpetual flames and the crafting of special tools and weapons. The festival's emphasis on purification and renewal reflected the otherworldly power of spring's return. The practice of blessing livestock, tools and households during Imbolc created protective barriers against supernatural threats while invoking otherworldly assistance for the coming agricultural season. The making of Brigid's crosses from rushes or straw, hung in houses and barns for protection, preserved ancient traditions about the goddess's power to ward off malevolent influences. Beltane, celebrated on May 1st, represented the full flowering of spring fertility and the opening of the summer season. The festival's emphasis on fertility and the union of opposing forces created powerful otherworldly openings that required careful management. Archaeological evidence from sites like Uisneach in Ireland reveals elaborate fire ceremonies that involved the lighting of twin bonfires, between which cattle were driven for purification and protection. The Maypole traditions associated with Beltane preserve ancient Celtic practices of sacred marriage between earth and sky. The pole's phallic symbolism, combined with the weaving of ribbons that represented the union of male and female principles, created a ritual enactment of cosmic fertility. The selection of May Queens and Green Men for festival celebrations preserved traditions about the temporary embodiment of otherworldly fertility powers by human representatives. Lugh, celebrated on August 1st, marked the beginning of the harvest season and honoured the god Lugh's sacrifice to ensure agricultural abundance. The festival's emphasis on skilled competition, athletics, craftsmanship and poetry reflected Lugh's role as the divine master of all arts. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tailten in Ireland reveals large earthwork amphitheatres that were used for seasonal gatherings involving thousands of participants from across the island. The concept of sacred kingship formed a crucial link between otherworldly power and earthly authority throughout Celtic territories. Kings were understood as intermediaries between human communities and supernatural forces, responsible for maintaining the cosmic order that ensured fertility, prosperity, and protection. This divine dimension of kingship created elaborate obligations and restrictions that governed royal behaviour while establishing the supernatural foundations of political legitimacy. The relationship between the king and the sovereignty goddess represented the core of Celtic royal ideology. This divine feminine figure, who appeared in various forms across Celtic territories, embodied the land's fertility and the people's prosperity. The king's marriage to the sovereignty goddess, whether literal or symbolic, established his right to rule while creating obligations to maintain the land's well-being. Archaeological evidence from royal inauguration sites reveals the material culture associated with these sacred marriages, including ritual vessels, ceremonial weapons, and offerings to otherworldly powers. The inauguration ceremony at the Stone of Destiny at Tara demonstrates the otherworldly validation required for legitimate kingship. The stone's supernatural cry when touched by a rightful king provided divine confirmation of royal authority while establishing the cosmic significance of political succession. The ceremony's location at Tara, a site with over 4,000 years of continuous ritual activity, connected new kings to the accumulated otherworldly power of their predecessors. The Celtic conception of heroism transcended mere physical prowess to encompass a complex amalgamation of supernatural ability, moral obligation, and tragic inevitability. Celtic heroes operated within a framework of sacred duties and mystical constraints that elevated their exploits beyond ordinary human achievement, while simultaneously binding them to fates that often proved catastrophic. Archaeological evidence from warrior graves across Celtic territories reveals the material culture that supported these heroic ideals. Elaborately decorated weapons, imported luxury goods, and ritual deposits that demonstrate the elevated status accorded to exceptional warriors. Cú Chulainn represents the archetypal Celtic hero whose extraordinary abilities and tragic fate embody the fundamental contradictions of heroic existence. His supernatural birth, through the union of his mother Deichtire with the god Lugh, established his liminal position between mortal and divine realms. The circumstances of his conception during a magical snowstorm that trapped the Ulster nobles in the Otherworld demonstrate the cosmic significance of his existence. His foster father Swaltam's role as his nominal earthly parent reflects the Celtic understanding that heroic figures require both divine and human parentage to function effectively in the mortal world. The hero's childhood exploits at Emen Macha established his exceptional nature through a series of supernatural feats that defied normal human limitations. His single-handed defeat of the boy troop of Ulster, comprising 150 young warriors, demonstrated his combat superiority, while his ability to play hurling against an entire team simultaneously revealed his superhuman coordination and speed. The incident where he killed the hound of Culainn the smith and subsequently took the animal's place as guardian of the forge earned him his adult name while establishing his connection to the supernatural realm of craftsmanship and metalworking. The Ríastrad or warp spasm represented Cú Chulainn's most distinctive supernatural ability, transforming him from a handsome youth into a terrifying engine of destruction. Contemporary descriptions detail the physical manifestations of this battle fury. His hair stood on end with sparks flying from each strand. One eye receded deep into his skull while the other bulged from its socket. his mouth stretched back to his ears, revealing every tooth, and his muscles swelled until they burst through his skin. The hero's body temperature rose so dramatically that snow melted in a wide circle around him, and his battle cry could kill 100 warriors from sheer terror. Archaeological evidence from Iron Age warrior graves provides material context for understanding the Ríastrad phenomenon. Excavations at sites like Dürnberg in Austria have revealed warriors buried with weapons showing evidence of frenzied use. Swords with multiple nicks and dents, spearheads bent from repeated impacts, and shields pierced by numerous wounds. The presence of human bone fragments embedded in weapon blades suggests that Celtic warriors did indeed achieve states of supernatural battle fury that allowed them to inflict devastating damage on their enemies. The heroes' training with Scathach on the Isle of Skye established the educational framework through which Celtic warriors acquired their supernatural abilities. Scathach, whose name means shadow or shade, operated a warrior school that attracted heroes from across the Celtic world. Her island fortress, accessible only by crossing a narrow bridge that bucked and threw back unsuccessful candidates, served as a testing ground that separated ordinary warriors from those destined for heroic status. The bridge's supernatural properties, it would rise up and hurl back anyone who lacked the proper combination of skill, courage, and divine favour, ensured that only truly exceptional individuals could reach the warrior woman's instruction. The curriculum at Scathach's school encompassed far more than conventional military training. Students learned the salmon leap, a supernatural jumping technique that allowed warriors to leap over their enemies' shields and strike from above. The apple feet required warriors to balance on the points of spears while fighting, demonstrating the integration of acrobatic skill with combat effectiveness. The rope feat involved walking along a taut rope while engaging multiple opponents, testing both balance and tactical awareness. These techniques, while seemingly fantastic, reflect authentic Celtic warrior traditions that emphasized individual skill and supernatural ability over conventional military formations. Scathach's weapons training introduced Cú Chulainn to the Gaebolga, a barbed spear that could only be thrown with the foot and created 30 wounds in its victim's body. The weapon's supernatural properties, it never missed its target and could not be withdrawn without killing the victim, established it as more than a mere tool of war. The Gaebolga represented the ultimate expression of the warrior's supernatural skill, requiring perfect technique and divine favour to employ effectively. Archaeological discoveries of elaborate spearheads with multiple barbs and flanges throughout Celtic territories suggest that such weapons had material as well as mythological existence. The hero's relationship with the Morrigan reveals the complex interaction between individual warriors and the supernatural forces that governed warfare. The Morrigan's appearance to Cú Chulainn in multiple forms, as a young woman offering love, as a crow perched on his shoulder, as an eel attempting to trip him during combat, demonstrates the multifaceted nature of divine intervention in heroic careers. Her prophecy of his death, delivered while he was still at the height of his powers, established the tragic inevitability that characterized Celtic heroic narratives. The hero's violation of his geasa reveals the impossible moral dilemmas that ultimately destroyed even the greatest Celtic heroes. Cú Chulainn laboured under multiple geasa that reflected his complex identity and supernatural nature. He was forbidden to eat the flesh of dogs due to his name's connection to the Hound of Chulainn, yet he was also bound by the obligation to accept hospitality when offered. When enemies deliberately placed him in a situation where he had to choose between violating his dietary prohibition or refusing hospitality, they created an impossible moral trap that ensured his downfall. The circumstances of his final battle demonstrate how supernatural constraints could be manipulated by clever enemies to neutralize even the most powerful heroes. the daughters of Calatin, seeking revenge for their father's death at Cú Chulainn's hands, used sorcery to create phantom armies that forced the hero to violate his geas against fighting alone. Their magical manipulation of his perception, making him believe that Ulster was under attack when it was actually at peace, demonstrates the vulnerability of even supernatural heroes to deception and illusion. The hero's death at the Pillar Stone reveals the tragic nobility that characterised Celtic heroic ideals. Mortally wounded by Lugh's spear, Cú Chulainn tied himself to a standing stone so that he could die on his feet while facing his enemies. His final act of defiance, using his sword to cut off the hand of an enemy who approached to take his head, demonstrated that heroic honour persisted even beyond death. The appearance of the Morrigan, in the form of a crow landing on his shoulder, served as the supernatural confirmation of his passing, while establishing his transformation from a mortal hero to otherworldly guardian. The Fianna represented a different model of heroic organisation, operating as a professional warrior band that served the High King of Ireland while maintaining independence from local tribal structures. Unlike the Ulster heroes who are bound by birth and kinship to specific territories, the Fianna recruited members from across Ireland based on individual merit and supernatural ability. This voluntary association created a meritocratic warrior culture that emphasised personal excellence over hereditary status. The rigorous testing required for admission to the Fianna established standards that went far beyond conventional military requirements. Candidates had to demonstrate mastery of poetry and traditional lore, memorising vast collections of myths, genealogies and legal precedents. The intellectual requirements reflected the Celtic understanding that true warriors must possess wisdom as well as physical prowess. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with the Fianna reveals the presence of Ogham stones and other inscribed monuments that may have served as teaching aids for aspiring members. The physical tests for Fianna membership pushed candidates to superhuman limits that reflected the organisation's supernatural nature. The candidate was placed in a waist-deep hole with only a shield and a hazel stick, while 9 warriors hurled spears at him from a distance of 9 ridges. Success required not only exceptional defensive skill, but also the supernatural awareness needed to anticipate and deflect multiple simultaneous attacks. The pursuit test required the candidate to run through the forests of Ireland while being chased by the entire Fianna, with a head start of only 1 tree's length. The candidate had to maintain his lead while leaving no trace of his passage, no broken twig, no displaced stone, no bent blade of grass. The Fianna's seasonal lifestyle reflected their liminal position between civilization and wilderness. During the winter months from Samhain to Beltane, they lived as guests in the houses of nobles throughout Ireland, participating in the social and political life of settled communities. The obligations of hospitality that governed these arrangements created networks of mutual obligation that connected the Fianna to the broader Irish aristocracy while maintaining their independence from local political conflicts. The summer months transformed the Fianna into a wilderness organisation that patrolled Ireland's borders and maintained order in the wild places beyond settled control. Their ability to live entirely off the land, hunting deer and wild boar while sleeping under the stars, demonstrated their mastery of the natural world. The Fianna's intimate knowledge of Ireland's geography, every mountain, forest, river and plain, made them invaluable as guides and scouts while establishing their role as guardians of the land itself. Finn Macumhale's leadership of the Fianna combined supernatural wisdom with practical military skill. His acquisition of the Salmon of Knowledge, which granted him access to all wisdom when he sucked his thumb, established his role as both warrior and sage. The circumstances of this acquisition, accidentally burning his thumb while cooking the salmon for his master, the druid Finneses, demonstrate the often unexpected ways in which supernatural knowledge was transmitted. The salmon's origin in the Well of Wisdom, where it had fed on hazelnuts that contained all knowledge, connected Finn's wisdom to the otherworldly sources of divine inspiration. The hero's relationship with the otherworld manifested through his numerous encounters with supernatural women who tested his wisdom and courage. His marriage to Sadb, who had been transformed into a deer by the Dark Druid, resulted in the birth of Oisin, the greatest poet among the Fianna. The circumstances of their meeting, Sadb's appearance at the Hill of Allen in human form, protected by the sanctuary of Finn's fortress, established the principle that otherworldly beings could find refuge in places of heroic power. Her eventual recapture by the Dark Druid, despite Finn's protection, demonstrated the limits of even supernatural heroes when confronting otherworldly enemies. The concept of Geas permeated Celtic heroic culture, creating a complex web of sacred obligations that governed heroic behaviour while ultimately ensuring their tragic downfall. These supernatural prohibitions, often imposed at birth or during moments of supernatural encounter, served multiple functions in Celtic society. They established the exceptional nature of heroes by marking them as individuals bound by otherworldly law. They created narrative tension by establishing inevitable conflicts between competing obligations, and they provided explanations for the ultimate failure of even the most powerful heroes. The nature of Geasa varied considerably, reflecting the specific circumstances of each hero's supernatural connections. Some Geasa were protective, such as Cú Chulainn's prohibition against eating dog meat, which maintained his supernatural strength by avoiding symbolic cannibalism. Others were restrictive, such as his obligation to accept any challenge issued by a warrior of equal status, which prevented him from avoiding dangerous confrontations. Still others were temporal, such as his prohibition against fighting after sunset, which limited his effectiveness during extended campaigns. The systematic violation of Geasa that characterized heroic downfalls reveals the sophisticated understanding of fate and free will that underlay Celtic heroic narratives. Heroes were not simply victims of supernatural compulsion, but active participants in their own destruction through choices that prioritized honor over survival. The tragic irony that heroes' greatest virtues, their courage, generosity and loyalty, ultimately led to their downfall reflects the Celtic understanding that excellence carried inherent dangers that could not be avoided through wisdom or caution. Female warriors occupied a distinctive position in Celtic heroic culture, combining martial prowess with supernatural authority in ways that challenged conventional gender roles. Scatach's role as the premier warrior trainer of the Celtic world established women as the ultimate authorities on heroic excellence. Her ability to defeat any male warrior who challenged her, combined with her knowledge of supernatural fighting techniques, positioned her as a figure who transcended normal gender limitations through superior skill and otherworldly power. The warrior woman's island fortress served as a liminal space where conventional social rules were suspended in favour of meritocratic principles. Male heroes who succeeded in reaching Scatach's school had to accept instruction from a female superior, reversing the normal gender hierarchy of Celtic society. Archaeological evidence from Celtic territories reveals the material culture associated with female warriors. Excavations at sites like Vix in France and Rheinheim in Germany have uncovered elaborate female burials containing weapons, armour, and imported luxury goods that indicate high social status. The Vix burial, dating to approximately 500 BCE, contained a massive bronze crater, along with a golden torque and other indicators of royal status. The presence of weapons in these burials suggests that some Celtic women did indeed achieve warrior status, though the extent of female military participation remains debated among scholars. Queen Medb of Connaught represents the fusion of female warrior prowess with political authority and supernatural sovereignty. Her role as the instigator of the Tainn Bo Cuailnge demonstrates her ability to mobilize military resources on a scale that rivaled any male ruler. The army she assembled for the cattle raid, drawn from throughout Ireland and including supernatural allies, established her as a figure whose authority transcended normal political boundaries. Her personal combat skills, demonstrated in her single combat with the various Ulster heroes, proved that her leadership was based on individual prowess as well as political position. The Queen's sexuality served as both a source of power and a weapon of war, in ways that reflected Celtic concepts of female sovereignty. Her numerous marriages and affairs, far from indicating promiscuity, demonstrated her ability to form and dissolve political alliances through intimate relationships. The pillow talk conversation with Ailill that initiated the cattle raid revealed how intimate relationships could become the foundation for major military campaigns. The Morrigan's role as both battle crow and sovereignty goddess demonstrates the complex relationship between warfare and political legitimacy in Celtic culture. Her appearance on battlefields in the form of a crow or raven, feeding on the corpses of fallen warriors, established her as the supernatural arbiter of military success. The warriors she favoured with her presence were guaranteed victory, while those she opposed faced inevitable defeat. Her ability to appear in human form as a beautiful woman, offering sovereignty to worthy heroes, connected military prowess to political authority through divine sanction. The goddess's prophetic abilities made her a crucial figure in the supernatural validation of heroic careers. Her predictions of victory or defeat, delivered through cryptic utterances that required interpretation, provided heroes with advanced knowledge of their fates while maintaining the element of tragic inevitability. The Morrigan's prophecy of Cú Chulainn's death, delivered while he was still at the height of his powers, established the temporal framework within which his heroic career would unfold. The concept of the sovereignty goddess extended beyond individual figures like the Morrigan to encompass a broader understanding of the relationship between political authority and the land itself. This divine feminine principle, which appeared in various forms across Celtic territories, embodied the fertility and prosperity that legitimate rulers were expected to provide. The king's symbolic marriage to the sovereignty goddess, whether through ritual ceremony or mythological narrative, established his right to rule while creating obligations to maintain the land's well-being. The testing of potential rulers by the sovereignty goddess reveals the criteria that Celtic society used to evaluate political legitimacy. The goddess typically appeared first as a hideous hag, offering herself to various candidates for kingship. Only the man who willingly accepted her embrace, demonstrating his commitment to the land regardless of its current condition, would witness her transformation into a beautiful woman, representing the prosperity that would follow his reign. This test emphasized the importance of unconditional commitment to the people's welfare over personal comfort or aesthetic preference. The warrior bands that served Celtic kings operated within a framework of supernatural obligation that connected individual prowess to cosmic order. These groups, whether the Red Branch of Ulster, the Fianna of Ireland, or similar organisations in other Celtic territories, served as the military expression of royal authority while maintaining their own traditions and loyalties. The tension between service to the king and loyalty to the band created dramatic conflicts that drove many of the most compelling heroic narratives. The initiation rituals that marked entry into these warrior bands typically involved supernatural elements that transformed ordinary fighters into heroic figures. The candidate's successful completion of seemingly impossible tasks defeating supernatural opponents, surviving otherworldly journeys, or demonstrating mastery of magical weapons, established his worthiness to join the heroic company. These initiations served both practical and symbolic functions, testing the candidate's abilities while marking his transformation from ordinary warrior to heroic figure. The relationship between individual heroes and their warrior bands reveals the complex balance between personal glory and collective identity that characterized Celtic heroic culture. Heroes were expected to excel as individuals while maintaining loyalty to their companions and leaders. The tragic conflicts that arose when these obligations contradicted each other, such as Cú Chulainn's single-handed defence of Ulster, while his companions lay under Macha's curse, demonstrate the impossible moral dilemmas that ultimately destroyed even the greatest heroes. The supernatural weapons and equipment that characterized Celtic heroic culture served as both practical tools and symbols of otherworldly authority. The elaborate decoration found on archaeological examples, intricate metalwork, imported materials and symbolic imagery indicates that these items functioned as status symbols as well as functional weapons. The legendary weapons of heroic literature, such as Cú Chulainn's Gaibolga or the various swords of the Fianna, represented the ultimate expression of the smith's craft enhanced by supernatural power. The relationship between heroes and their weapons often took on quasi-personal characteristics that reflected Celtic concepts of the spiritual essence inherent in crafted objects. Heroes' weapons were understood to possess their own supernatural qualities that complemented their wielder's abilities. The loss or destruction of a hero's signature weapon typically preceded his death, suggesting that the spiritual bond between warrior and weapon was essential to heroic effectiveness. The Druids occupied a unique position within Celtic society that transcended conventional religious, legal, and educational boundaries. Archaeological evidence from sanctuaries like Gournay-sur-Aronde and Ribemont-sur-Ancre reveals the material culture associated with druidical practice. Ritual deposits of weapons, human and animal remains arranged in specific patterns, and evidence of complex ceremonies that required extensive knowledge of astronomical cycles, legal precedents, and mythological traditions. These sites demonstrate that Druids operated sophisticated religious complexes that served multiple communities and required substantial resources to maintain. Caesar's account of Druidical education describes a system that required up to 20 years of intensive study, during which students memorized vast collections of oral material without recourse to written texts. The prohibition against writing sacred knowledge reflected the Celtic belief that spiritual power resided in the living transmission of wisdom from teacher to student. This oral tradition created a closed system of knowledge that maintained druidical authority while ensuring the accurate preservation of religious and legal material across generations. The druidical curriculum encompassed far more than religious instruction. Students learned the complex legal codes that governed Celtic society, including the intricate compensation systems that determined payment for various crimes and injuries. The Druids' role as judges required mastery of genealogical knowledge that could establish the legitimacy of legal claims, territorial boundaries, and inheritance disputes. Their astronomical knowledge enabled them to calculate the proper timing for religious festivals, agricultural activities, and legal proceedings that required celestial validation. The hierarchical structure of druidical orders reveals the sophisticated organization that maintained this educational system. The Archdruid, elected by his peers or sometimes chosen through combat, held supreme authority over religious and legal matters within his territory. Below him, specialized druids focused on particular aspects of knowledge. Some concentrated on legal precedents and judicial procedures, Others mastered the astronomical calculations required for festival timing, and still others specialised in the medical knowledge that made Druids renowned healers throughout the Celtic world. The Druids' role as intermediaries between human and divine realms required them to master complex ritual procedures that maintained cosmic order. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hayling Island and Uli demonstrates the elaborate nature of these ceremonies. At Hayling Island, excavations revealed a circular temple containing deposits of coins, jewellery and weapons that had been ritually bent or broken before offering. The systematic nature of these deposits, organised according to material type and arranged in specific patterns, suggests that Druids followed precise protocols when communicating with otherworldly powers. The ritual calendar that governed Druidical activities synchronized human society with cosmic rhythms through careful observation of celestial movements. The Druids' knowledge of solar and lunar cycles enabled them to predict eclipses, calculate the optimal timing for agricultural activities, and determine the proper dates for religious festivals. The Coligny calendar, discovered in France and dating to the 1st century BCE, provides material evidence of the sophisticated astronomical knowledge that Druids possessed. This bronze tablet, inscribed with a complex system of months and intercalary periods, demonstrates the mathematical precision required to maintain accurate timekeeping across multiple years. The Druids' medical knowledge combined practical herbal remedies with supernatural healing techniques that addressed both physical and spiritual ailments. Archaeological evidence from sites like Bath reveals the integration of natural healing properties with religious ritual. The thermal springs, dedicated to the goddess Sulis, attracted pilgrims from across Roman Britain who sought healing through both the water's mineral properties and the goddess's divine intervention. The curse tablets deposited in the sacred spring demonstrate how Druids channeled supernatural power to address their clients' problems, whether physical illness, legal disputes, or personal conflicts. The preservation of mythological knowledge represented one of the Druids' most crucial functions, as they served as the living repositories of Celtic cultural memory. The stories, genealogies, and traditional wisdom that they memorized provided the framework for understanding the relationship between human society and the natural world. The Druids' ability to recite the genealogies of noble families, trace the ownership of territories back through multiple generations, and recall the precedents that governed legal decisions made them indispensable to the functioning of Celtic society. The training of Druids involved not only memorization, but also the development of supernatural abilities that enhanced their effectiveness as religious practitioners. The pursuit of imbas, or poetic inspiration, required students to undergo specific rituals that opened their consciousness to otherworldly knowledge. The ritual of Tainam Laida involved chewing raw meat while reciting incantations, creating an altered state of consciousness that enabled the Druid to perceive hidden truths. The practice of Digital de Chenaib required the practitioner to compose spontaneous poetry while in a trance state, demonstrating the integration of artistic and prophetic abilities. The relationship between Druids and political authority created a complex balance of power that influenced Celtic governance throughout the pre-Roman period. Kings required Druidical validation for their authority, as the Druids' knowledge of genealogy and precedent could confirm or challenge claims to legitimate rule. The Druids' ability to place individuals under geas, or sacred prohibitions, gave them significant leverage over political leaders who depended on supernatural sanction for their authority. Archaeological evidence from royal sites like Tara and Cruachan reveals the close association between political and religious power, with Druidical quarters located adjacent to royal halls. The Druids' role in warfare extended beyond simple blessing of weapons and warriors to encompass strategic planning and psychological warfare. Their knowledge of terrain, weather patterns, and enemy movements made them valuable military advisors, while their ability to curse opponents and inspire their own forces through supernatural means provided tactical advantages. The Druids' presence on battlefields, documented in classical sources, involved specific rituals that invoke divine protection while demoralizing enemies through displays of supernatural power. The bardic tradition that operated alongside druidical education preserved and transmitted Celtic mythology through sophisticated poetic techniques that aided memorization while maintaining narrative coherence. The Philid of Ireland and the Beard of Wales underwent extensive training that combined literary skill with genealogical knowledge, legal expertise, and supernatural abilities. These professional poets held privileged positions in Celtic society, with their quarters located near royal halls and their persons protected by sacred taboos that made violence against them a serious crime. The hierarchical structure of bardic orders reflected the complexity of their educational system and the varying levels of expertise required for different poetic functions. The Olam, the highest rank of Fili, required 12 years of training and mastery of over 250 different poetic forms. These master poets possessed the right to travel freely between kingdoms, receive hospitality from any noble household, and speak directly to kings without fear of punishment. Their authority derived not only from their literary skill, but also from their role as keepers of genealogical and legal knowledge that could validate or challenge political claims. The technical aspects of bardic composition reveal the sophisticated mnemonic techniques that enabled accurate transmission of mythological material across generations. The use of alliteration, internal rhyme, and complex metrical patterns created memorable verse structures that aided recall while providing aesthetic pleasure. The employment of kennings, metaphorical compound phrases that described familiar concepts in novel ways, demonstrated the poet's creativity while encoding cultural knowledge in compressed form. The practice of enjambment, where sentences continued across line breaks, created flowing narratives that maintained listener engagement during lengthy recitations. The relationship between meter and meaning in Celtic poetry created multiple layers of significance that rewarded careful attention while providing entertainment for casual listeners. The choice of specific metrical patterns could indicate the type of story being told, the social status of the characters involved, or the emotional tone appropriate to the narrative. The use of derbida, a quatrain form with specific rhyme schemes and syllable counts, marked heroic narratives and elevated the subject matter through formal complexity. The employment of Ranigecht, with its intricate internal rhyme patterns, demonstrated the poet's technical mastery while creating hypnotic rhythms that enhanced the magical atmosphere of otherworldly tales. The bardic emphasis on genealogical knowledge served multiple functions beyond simple entertainment, as these recitations validated political authority, established legal precedents, and preserved cultural memory. The ability to trace royal lineages back to mythological ancestors provided divine sanction for contemporary rulers while connecting them to the heroic achievements of their predecessors. The preservation of territorial boundaries through genealogical recitation created legal documents that could be consulted during disputes over land ownership or succession rights. The integration of mythological and historical material in bardic recitations created a seamless narrative that connected contemporary events to cosmic patterns. The poet's ability to place current rulers within the framework of mythological cycles demonstrated the continuing relevance of ancient wisdom while providing models for proper behaviour. The use of prophetic elements in genealogical poetry enabled bards to influence political decisions by suggesting that certain actions would fulfill ancient prophecies or avoid predicted disasters. The pursuit of imbas represented the highest achievement of both druidical and bardic education, as this supernatural inspiration enabled practitioners to access knowledge that transcended normal human limitations. The techniques for achieving imbas varied but typically involved specific rituals that altered consciousness and opened the practitioner to otherworldly influence. The ritual of imbas forestnae required the practitioner to chew raw meat from a sacrificed animal while lying in darkness, creating conditions that facilitated prophetic visions. The practice of tabhais involved sleeping on the hide of a freshly slaughtered bull while surrounded by druids who chanted protective incantations. The manifestations of imbas could take various forms, from spontaneous poetic composition to prophetic visions that revealed future events. The ability to compose perfect poetry without preparation demonstrated the practitioner's connection to otherworldly sources of inspiration. The capacity to perceive hidden truths about past events, distant locations, or concealed objects established the practitioner's supernatural authority. The power to curse enemies through satirical verse or bless allies through praise poetry made practitioners of imbes formidable figures whose words carried tangible consequences. The relationship between poetry and prophecy in Celtic culture reflected the belief that artistic inspiration and supernatural knowledge derived from the same otherworldly sources. The poet's ability to perceive patterns in human behaviour, natural phenomena, and cosmic cycles enabled them to make predictions that often proved accurate. The use of symbolic language in prophetic poetry created multiple layers of meaning that could be interpreted differently as circumstances changed. The employment of conditional prophecies, predictions that would come true only if certain actions were taken or avoided, gave poets significant influence over political and military decisions. The decline of Druidism began with the Roman conquest of Gaul and accelerated during the conquest of Britain, as Roman authorities systematically suppressed druidical activities that threatened imperial control. The Romans' particular hostility toward Druids reflected their understanding of the Druids' role in organising resistance to Roman rule. The destruction of the Druidical centre on Anglesey in 60 CE, described by Tacitus, eliminated the primary training ground for British Druids and disrupted the transmission of traditional knowledge. The prohibition against Roman citizens participating in Druidical activities enacted under Augustus gradually reduced the Druids' influence among the Romanised Celtic elite. The transformation of Druidical functions under Roman rule reveals the adaptability of Celtic religious traditions to new political circumstances. Some Druids adapted their practices to Roman legal and religious frameworks, serving as priests in Romano-Celtic temples or as legal advisors who interpreted Roman law for Celtic communities. The integration of Celtic deities into the Roman pantheon created opportunities for Druids to maintain their religious functions while acknowledging Roman authority. The development of Romano-Celtic art styles in religious contexts demonstrates the creative synthesis that emerged from this cultural interaction. The survival of Druidical knowledge in Ireland, which remained outside Roman control, preserved traditions that would otherwise have been lost. The Irish Druids' gradual conversion to Christianity created opportunities for the preservation of pre-Christian knowledge within monastic contexts. The early Irish Church's tolerance for native learning traditions enabled monks to record oral material that Druids had previously transmitted without written texts. The development of Irish monasticism as a centre of learning attracted scholars from across Europe who helped preserve and transmit Celtic traditions. The role of monastic scribes in preserving mythological knowledge created a unique synthesis of Christian and pagan traditions that characterised early medieval Irish culture. The monks' literacy skills enabled them to record oral traditions that had been maintained for centuries without written documentation. Their theological training provided frameworks for interpreting pagan material in ways that made it acceptable to Christian audiences. The monastery's scriptoria became centres for the production of manuscripts that preserved not only religious texts, but also the mythological cycles that embodied Celtic cultural memory. The techniques that monastic scribes used to preserve oral traditions reveal their sophisticated understanding of both Celtic and Christian literary conventions. The employment of Irish vernacular for mythological material, while reserving Latin for religious texts, demonstrated respect for the integrity of native traditions. The use of marginal glosses to explain unfamiliar terms or concepts ensured that future readers would understand references to pre-Christian beliefs and practices. The creation of elaborate illuminated manuscripts elevated mythological material to the same artistic level as religious texts, indicating the cultural value placed on preserving Celtic traditions. The adaptation of mythological material to Christian contexts required careful editing that preserved essential narrative elements while eliminating or reinterpreting problematic content. The transformation of pagan deities into historical figures, angels, or demons enabled scribes to maintain their roles in traditional stories while conforming to Christian theological requirements. The reinterpretation of magical elements as divine miracles or demonic deceptions preserved the supernatural aspects of Celtic mythology while making them comprehensible to Christian audiences. The addition of Christian moral frameworks to pagan narratives created hybrid texts that served both entertainment and instructional purposes. The preservation of legal and genealogical material alongside mythological narratives demonstrates the comprehensive nature of the knowledge that Druids and bards had maintained through oral transmission. The lore tracts that survive from early medieval Ireland preserve detailed information about social organisation, property rights, and legal procedures that governed Celtic society. The genealogical collections that trace royal lineages back to mythological ancestors provide insights into the political structures that connected earthly authority to otherworldly power. The medical texts that record herbal remedies and healing procedures preserve the practical knowledge that made Druids renowned throughout the Celtic world. The transformation of bardic traditions under Christian influence created new forms of poetry that combined native literary techniques with Christian themes and imagery. The development of religious poetry in Irish and Welsh demonstrated the adaptability of Celtic literary traditions to new spiritual contexts. The creation of lives of saints that employed traditional heroic narratives established Christian holy men as successors to pagan heroes. The composition of vision literature that described journeys to otherworldly realms adapted traditional Celtic concepts of the otherworld to Christian ideas about heaven and hell. The influence of preserved Celtic traditions on medieval European literature extended far beyond the Celtic territories themselves, as Irish and Welsh manuscripts circulated throughout the continent. The transmission of Celtic mythological themes through Arthurian romance introduced European audiences to distinctively Celtic concepts of heroism, sovereignty, and otherworldly adventure. The influence of Celtic poetic techniques on medieval Latin poetry demonstrated the continuing vitality of native literary traditions. The preservation of Celtic legal concepts in medieval law codes showed how pre-Christian institutions could be adapted to new political and religious contexts. The arrival of Christianity in Celtic territories initiated a complex process of cultural transformation that would reshape the mythological landscape of Western Europe. Unlike the Roman conquest, which sought to suppress or co-opt Celtic religious practices through military force, Christian missionaries employed sophisticated strategies of adaptation and reinterpretation that preserved substantial elements of pre-Christian belief while gradually transforming their meaning and context. archaeological evidence from sites across Ireland, Wales, Scotland and Brittany reveals the material traces of this religious transition. Pagan symbols carved alongside Christian crosses, sacred wells rededicated to saints, and burial practices that blended Christian and Celtic traditions. The conversion process began in different regions at varying times and proceeded through distinct phases that reflected local political conditions and cultural circumstances. In Ireland, the traditional date of 432 CE for Patrick's arrival marks the beginning of systematic Christian evangelization, though archaeological evidence suggests that Christian communities existed in Ireland decades earlier. The discovery of Ogham stones bearing Christian symbols in context dating to the late 4th century indicates that Christianity had already begun to penetrate Irish society through trade contacts and cultural exchange with Roman Britain and Gaul. Patrick's own writings, particularly his Confessio and Letter to Coroticus, provide insights into the challenges faced by early Christian missionaries in Celtic societies. His account of being sold into slavery in Ireland as a youth, his subsequent escape and religious calling, and his return as a missionary reveals the personal networks that facilitated Christian expansion. The text describes his encounters with Druids who challenged his authority, his use of native Irish to communicate Christian concepts, and his adaptation of local customs to Christian purposes. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Patrick's mission, including the ecclesiastical complex at Armagh and the pilgrimage site at Croagh Patrick, demonstrates the material investment required to establish permanent Christian institutions in previously pagan territories. The missionary strategies employed by early Christian evangelists reveal sophisticated understanding of Celtic religious psychology and social organisation. Rather than directly attacking pagan beliefs, missionaries often sought to demonstrate Christianity's superior power through public confrontations with Druids and pagan priests. The famous account of Patrick's confrontation with the Druids at Tara, where he allegedly lit the Paschal fire before the Druids could kindle their Beltane fires, illustrates the symbolic competition between Christian and pagan religious authority. Archaeological excavations at Tara have revealed evidence of significant changes in ritual activity during the 5th century, including the abandonment of traditional ceremonial deposits and the construction of Christian burial grounds within the ancient royal complex. The adaptation of Celtic sacred sites for Christian use represents one of the most visible aspects of the conversion process. Throughout Celtic territories, pre-Christian sanctuaries were transformed into Christian churches, monasteries and pilgrimage destinations through careful preservation of their sacred associations while redirecting their spiritual focus. The monastery of Glendalough in Ireland, founded by St. Kevin in the 6th century, was established in a valley that had previously served as a pagan sanctuary associated with water worship and otherworldly communication. The site's numerous holy wells, round towers and stone churches demonstrate how Christian institutions could be successfully integrated into landscapes that retain their sacred significance. The Christianization of sacred wells throughout Celtic territories illustrates the systematic approach missionaries took to transforming pagan religious practices. These natural water sources, which had served as focal points for Celtic religious activity for centuries, were rededicated to Christian saints while maintaining their reputation for healing and supernatural intervention. The Well of St. Brigid at Kildare, built over a pre-Christian sanctuary associated with the goddess Brigid, continued to attract pilgrims seeking healing and divine favour. Archaeological investigations at the site have revealed continuous ritual activity from the Iron Age through the medieval period, with Christian artefacts gradually replacing pagan votive offerings while maintaining similar patterns of deposition and pilgrimage. the transformation of Celtic festivals into Christian celebrations required careful timing and symbolic adaptation that preserved popular traditions while redirecting their religious significance. The Festival of Samhain, which marked the Celtic New Year and the opening of the Otherworld, was gradually transformed into All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, maintaining its association with the dead while placing it within a Christian theological framework. The lighting of bonfires, the preparation of special foods, and the practice of visiting graves continued under Christian auspices, though their meaning was reinterpreted in terms of Christian concepts of salvation and intercession. Imbolc, the festival associated with the goddess Brigid and the return of spring, became the Feast of St. Brigid of Kildare, preserving the seasonal timing and many traditional practices while attributing them to a Christian saint. The making of Brigid's crosses from rushes, the blessing of livestock and agricultural tools, and the lighting of candles continued as Christian customs that maintained their connection to agricultural cycles and seasonal renewal. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with St. Brigid reveals the gradual transformation of goddess worship into saint veneration, with Christian symbols and artifacts gradually replacing pagan religious objects while maintaining similar patterns of devotional activity. The process of transforming Celtic deities into Christian saints required sophisticated theological maneuvering that preserved their essential functions while conforming to Christian doctrine. The goddess Brigid's transformation into Saint Brigid of Kildare illustrates this process in remarkable detail. The saint's traditional biography, recorded in medieval hagiographies, preserves many elements of the goddess's mythological profile. Her association with fire, metalworking and poetry, her role as a patron of fertility and healing, and her connection to sacred wells and perpetual flames. The monastery at Kildare, which maintained a sacred fire tended by nuns, directly continued the pre-Christian tradition of the goddess's eternal flame, while placing it within a Christian institutional framework. The saint's miraculous powers, as recorded in her Vita, demonstrate clear continuities with the goddess's supernatural abilities. Her capacity to multiply food and drink, heal the sick through touch or prayer, and control natural phenomena preserve the goddess's role as a provider of abundance and supernatural intervention. The story of her cloak expanding to cover vast territories when she requested land for her monastery echoes the goddess's association with territorial sovereignty and the expansion of sacred space. The saint's patronage of metalworkers, poets and scholars maintained the goddess's connection to skilled craftsmanship and intellectual pursuits while adapting them to Christian educational and artistic contexts. The cult of St. Brigid spread throughout Celtic territories, establishing her as one of the most popular saints in Ireland, Scotland and Wales. The numerous churches, wells and place names associated with her demonstrate the geographic extent of her veneration and the successful transformation of goddess worship into Christian devotion. The saint's feast day on February 1st preserved the timing of the pre-Christian Imbolc festival, while creating a Christian celebration that maintained many traditional customs and practices. Similar transformations occurred with other major Celtic deities, though the process varied depending on local conditions and the specific characteristics of each divine figure. The god Lugh's transformation into various saints named Lugard, Malua or Lugh itself preserved his association with skill, kingship and solar symbolism while adapting them to Christian contexts. The festival of Ríastrad became associated with various harvest saints, maintaining its connection to agricultural abundance and seasonal transition, while placing it within a Christian liturgical framework. The war goddess Morrigan proved more challenging to Christianize due to her associations with death, prophecy, and battlefield violence. Rather than direct transformation into a saint, Her attributes were distributed among various Christian figures. Her prophetic abilities were attributed to certain saints known for their visions and prophecies. Her association with death was incorporated into Christian concepts of martyrdom and spiritual warfare, and her role as a sovereignty goddess was transferred to the Virgin Mary in her capacity as Queen of Heaven. The Christianization of Celtic heroic literature required extensive editorial work that preserved narrative structures while transforming their religious and moral frameworks. The Ulster cycle, with its emphasis on individual heroism and warrior values, was gradually adapted to Christian concepts of spiritual warfare and moral virtue. Cú Chulainn's supernatural abilities were reinterpreted as divine gifts that could be used for righteous purposes, while his tragic fate was explained in terms of the consequences of pride and violence. The hero's connection to the god Lugh was downplayed in favour of emphasising his human qualities and moral struggles. The Fenian cycle proved more amenable to Christian adaptation due to its emphasis on loyalty, service, and protection of the innocent. Finn MacCumhaill and his warriors were gradually transformed into proto-Christian figures whose adventures could be read as allegories of spiritual struggle and moral development. The Fianna's role as protectors of Ireland was reinterpreted as a form of Christian service, while their seasonal lifestyle was seen as a model of ascetic discipline and spiritual purification. The preservation of mythological material in medieval manuscripts required careful editorial decisions that balanced the desire to maintain traditional narratives with the need to conform to Christian theological requirements. Monastic scribes developed sophisticated techniques for handling problematic content. Pagan deities were described as historical figures who had been mistakenly worshipped as gods. Magical elements were attributed to demonic deception or divine intervention, and moral frameworks were added to explain the consequences of various actions within Christian terms. The scribes' treatment of supernatural elements reveals their nuanced understanding of both Celtic and Christian worldviews. Rather than simply eliminating magical content, they often recontextualized it within Christian theological frameworks that could accommodate supernatural phenomena while maintaining orthodox doctrine. Miracles performed by Druids were attributed to demonic power, while similar feats by Christian saints were explained as divine interventions. Otherworldly journeys were reinterpreted as visions of heaven or hell, while maintaining their essential narrative structures and symbolic content. The development of Irish monasticism created unique opportunities for preserving Celtic traditions within Christian institutional frameworks. The monastic schools that emerged in Ireland during the 6th and 7th centuries combined Christian theological education with traditional Irish learning, creating a synthesis that preserved substantial elements of pre-Christian knowledge while adapting them to Christian purposes. The curriculum at these schools included not only Latin and biblical studies, but also Irish law, poetry and traditional law that had previously been maintained through oral transmission. The role of monastic scribes in recording oral traditions represents one of the most significant cultural achievements of early medieval Europe. These literate monks, trained in both Christian theology and traditional Irish learning, possessed the skills necessary to transform oral material into written texts while maintaining their essential content and meaning. The manuscripts they produced, including the Book of Leinster, the Book of the Dun Cow, and the Yellow Book of Lecan, preserve mythological material that would otherwise have been lost with the decline of the traditional bardic system. The techniques these scribes used to preserve oral traditions reveal their sophisticated understanding of both Celtic literary conventions and Christian theological requirements. They employed Irish vernacular for mythological material while reserving Latin for religious texts, demonstrating respect for the integrity of native traditions. They added explanatory glosses to clarify unfamiliar terms or concepts, ensuring that future readers would understand references to pre-Christian beliefs and practices. They created elaborate illuminated manuscripts that elevated mythological material to the same artistic level as religious texts, indicating the cultural value placed on preserving Celtic traditions. The adaptation of Celtic legal traditions to Christian contexts required extensive reinterpretation that preserved essential social functions while conforming to Christian moral principles. The Brecon laws of Ireland, which had been maintained through oral transmission by professional jurists, were gradually written down and modified to incorporate Christian concepts of justice and morality. The law tracts that survive from this period reveal the complex process of legal adaptation. Traditional compensation systems were maintained, but modified to reflect Christian concepts of sin and redemption. Marriage laws were adjusted to conform to Christian monogamy while preserving some traditional practices, and property rights were redefined to accommodate Christian concepts of charity and social responsibility. The transformation of Celtic concepts of kingship under Christian influence created new models of political authority that combined traditional notions of divine sanction with Christian concepts of moral responsibility. The idea of the king as the earthly representative of divine authority was maintained but reinterpreted in terms of Christian kingship, with rulers expected to govern according to Christian moral principles while maintaining their traditional obligations to ensure prosperity and protect their people. The inauguration ceremonies that had previously involved symbolic marriage to the sovereignty goddess were replaced with Christian coronation rituals that emphasized the king's responsibility to God and his people. The Christianization of Celtic art and symbolism reveals the creative synthesis that emerged from the encounter between Celtic and Christian traditions. The development of distinctive Celtic Christian art styles, exemplified by the illuminated manuscripts and stone crosses of Ireland and Scotland, demonstrates how traditional Celtic artistic techniques could be adapted to Christian themes and subjects. The Book of Kells, with its elaborate interlaced patterns and stylized animal forms, represents the culmination of this artistic synthesis, combining Celtic decorative traditions with Christian iconography to create a uniquely Celtic Christian aesthetic. The high crosses that were erected throughout Ireland and Scotland during the 8th and 9th centuries illustrate the successful integration of Celtic and Christian symbolic systems. These massive stone monuments, carved with intricate patterns and biblical scenes, served as focal points for Christian worship while maintaining connections to pre-Christian traditions of sacred stone monuments. The cross's location at monastic sites and traditional assembly places created continuity between pagan and Christian sacred geography, while establishing new centres of Christian authority and influence. The preservation of Celtic place names and their associated mythological traditions demonstrates the persistence of pre-Christian cultural memory even within Christianized contexts. Throughout Celtic territories, landscape features retained their traditional names and associated stories, though these were often reinterpreted within Christian frameworks. Hills, rivers and valleys that had been associated with particular deities or mythological events continued to be recognized as special places, though their significance was explained in terms of Christian saints or biblical parallels. The development of Christian pilgrimage routes that incorporated pre-Christian sacred sites created new forms of religious practice that maintained connections to ancient traditions while serving Christian spiritual purposes. The pilgrimage to Croagh Patrick in Ireland, which involves climbing the mountain associated with the saint's 40-day fast, follows routes that had been used for pre-Christian ritual purposes. The stations along the pilgrimage route, marked by stone cairns and prayer sites, preserve traditional practices of mountain worship while adapting them to Christian devotional purposes. the transformation of Celtic seasonal observances into Christian liturgical celebrations required careful attention to timing and symbolic content that would maintain popular participation while redirecting religious focus. The Christian liturgical year was adjusted to accommodate traditional Celtic seasonal rhythms, with major Christian festivals scheduled to coincide with or replace important pagan celebrations. This synchronization ensured that the conversion process would not disrupt the agricultural and social cycles that governed Celtic community life, while gradually transforming their religious significance. The role of women in the Christianization process reveals the complex gender dynamics that characterized the conversion of Celtic societies. The high status of women in pre-Christian Celtic religion, exemplified by figures like the sovereignty goddess and female druids, created opportunities for women to assume leadership roles in early Christian communities. The numerous female saints venerated in Celtic territories, including Brigid of Kildare, Dymphna of Ireland, and Non of Wales, demonstrate the continued importance of female religious authority while adapting it to Christian institutional frameworks. The establishment of double monasteries, where communities of monks and nuns lived in close proximity under the authority of an abbess, preserved some aspects of the gender equality that had characterized pre-Christian Celtic religious practice. These institutions, which flourished in Ireland and Anglo-Saxon England, provided women with opportunities for education, religious authority, and cultural influence that were rare in other parts of medieval Europe. The abbesses who governed these communities, such as Hilda of Whitby and Brigid of Kildare, wielded considerable political and religious power while maintaining connections to traditional Celtic concepts of female sovereignty. The gradual decline of Druidism under Christian influence occurred through a combination of direct suppression, institutional replacement, and cultural transformation that eliminated the Druids' traditional roles while preserving some of their functions within Christian contexts. The Druids' educational role was assumed by monastic schools that provided literacy and learning within Christian frameworks. Their legal functions were transferred to Christian judges who applied modified versions of traditional law, and their religious authority was replaced by Christian priests who performed similar ritual functions while serving Christian rather than pagan deities. The process of transforming Druidical knowledge into Christian learning required extensive editorial work that preserved useful information while eliminating or reinterpreting problematic content. Medical knowledge was preserved and expanded within monastic infirmaries. Astronomical observations were incorporated into Christian computers' calculations for determining feast days, and legal precedents were maintained while being modified to conform to Christian moral principles. The result was a synthesis of Celtic and Christian learning that preserved substantial elements of pre-Christian knowledge while adapting them to serve Christian purposes. The survival of Celtic mythological themes in medieval European literature demonstrates the far-reaching influence of the Christianization process on broader cultural developments. The Arthurian romances that emerged in the 12th century incorporated distinctively Celtic concepts of heroism, sovereignty, and otherworldly adventure while placing them within Christian chivalric frameworks. The Grail legends, with their emphasis on spiritual quest and divine grace, adapted Celtic cauldron myths to Christian sacramental theology while maintaining their essential narrative structures and symbolic content. The influence of Celtic Christian monasticism on European intellectual development extended far beyond the preservation of mythological material to encompass broader contributions to education, scholarship, and cultural transmission. The Irish monasteries that served as centres of learning during the early medieval period attracted students from across Europe and played crucial roles in preserving classical texts and developing new forms of scholarship. The missionaries who travelled from Ireland to establish monasteries in Scotland, England, and continental Europe carried with them not only Christian doctrine, but also the intellectual traditions that had emerged from the synthesis of Celtic and Christian learning. The systematic documentation of Celtic mythology by 19th century scholars transformed oral traditions that had survived for centuries into accessible written collections that would reshape European understanding of its pre-Christian heritage. Lady Charlotte Guest's translation of the Mabinogion, published between 1838 and 1849, brought Welsh mythological material to English-speaking audiences for the first time, creating a foundation for scholarly study and popular appreciation of Celtic narrative traditions. Her work, based on manuscripts from the 14th and 15th centuries, preserved stories that had been transmitted orally for over a millennium, while making them comprehensible to Victorian readers through careful annotation and contextual explanation. Guest's translation methodology revealed both the opportunities and challenges inherent in presenting ancient Celtic material to modern audiences. Her decision to render medieval Welsh prose into flowing English narrative preserved the essential content while adapting it to contemporary literary expectations. The extensive notes she provided explained unfamiliar cultural concepts, identified mythological parallels, and traced the historical development of the stories through various manuscript traditions. Her work established the scholarly framework that would guide subsequent Celtic studies, while demonstrating the literary merit of Celtic mythological material to audiences who had previously dismissed it as primitive folklore. The impact of Guest's translation extended far beyond academic circles to influence Victorian literature, art, and cultural consciousness. Authors like Alfred Tennyson drew upon her work for their own creative projects, incorporating Celtic themes and characters into poetry that reached mass audiences. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood found inspiration in Celtic mythology for paintings that depicted otherworldly landscapes and supernatural encounters with unprecedented visual sophistication. The publication of the Mabinogion coincided with broader Victorian interests in medieval culture and national origins, creating a receptive audience for Celtic material that had previously been relegated to antiquarian curiosity. Concurrent developments in Irish scholarship produced similar results through the work of scholars like Eugene O'Curry and John O'Donovan, who undertook systematic surveys of Irish manuscripts and archaeological sites. O'Curry's lectures on the manuscript materials of ancient Irish history, delivered at the Catholic University of Dublin in the 1850s, provided the first comprehensive overview of Irish mythological cycles for English-speaking audiences. His detailed analysis of the Ulster cycle, Fenian cycle, and mythological cycle established the scholarly framework that continues to guide Irish mythological studies, while demonstrating the sophisticated literary achievement represented by these oral traditions. O'Donovan's work on Irish place names and topographical surveys created connections between mythological narratives and specific geographic locations throughout Ireland. His collaboration with the Ordnance Survey of Ireland during the 1830s and 1840s documented thousands of place names with associated mythological traditions, creating a comprehensive map of Ireland's legendary landscape. The survey's meticulous recording of local traditions preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost while establishing the geographic foundations for understanding Celtic mythological geography. The German scholarly tradition contributed significantly to Celtic revival through the comparative philological work of scholars like Johann Caspar Zeus and Rudolf Thurnason. Zeus's Grammatica Celtica, published in 1853, established the scientific study of Celtic languages and demonstrated their relationship to other Indo-European linguistic families. His work provided the methodological foundation for understanding Celtic texts in their original languages, while revealing the sophisticated grammatical structures that had preserved mythological material across centuries of oral transmission. Thurnison's subsequent work on Old Irish grammar and metrics enabled more precise translation and interpretation of early Irish texts, correcting errors in previous scholarship while revealing new layers of meaning in familiar stories. The Celtic revival movement that emerged in the late 19th century transformed scholarly interest in Celtic mythology into a broader cultural phenomenon that influenced literature, politics, and national identity throughout Celtic territories. The movement's emphasis on recovering authentic Celtic traditions created new audiences for mythological material while inspiring contemporary artists to create works that drew upon ancient themes and motifs. The revival's impact extended beyond Celtic territories to influence European and American culture, as Celtic mythology became associated with spiritual authenticity and connection to natural forces that seemed absent from industrial civilization. The Irish literary revival, spearheaded by figures like William Butler Yeats, Lady Augusta Gregory, and John Millington Synge, demonstrated the creative potential of Celtic mythological material for contemporary literature. Yeats's early poetry drew extensively upon Irish mythological sources, transforming ancient heroes and supernatural beings into symbols of Irish national identity and spiritual aspiration. His poem The Wanderings of Oisin, published in 1889, retold the Fenian hero's journey to the Otherworld in language that combined mythological authenticity with contemporary poetic sensibility. The work established Yeats as a major literary figure while demonstrating the continued relevance of Celtic mythology for modern artistic expression. Lady Gregory's work in collecting and retelling Irish folklore created accessible versions of mythological material that reached both scholarly and popular audiences. Her books Cú Chulainn of Muirthemne and Gods and Fighting Men presented the Ulster and Fenian cycles in prose that preserved their essential character while making this comprehensible to contemporary readers. Her collaboration with Yeats in founding the Abbey Theatre created a venue for dramatic works based on Celtic mythological themes, establishing a tradition of Celtic-inspired theatre that continues to influence Irish drama. The revival's political dimensions became increasingly apparent as Celtic mythology was employed to construct narratives of national identity that supported movements for political independence. In Ireland, the mythological cycles provided models of heroic resistance to foreign domination that resonated with contemporary struggles against British rule. The figure of Cú Chulainn defending Ulster single-handedly against overwhelming odds became a symbol of Irish determination and sacrifice that inspired revolutionary movements. The 1916 Easter Rising explicitly invoked Celtic mythological themes, with proclamations that connected contemporary political action to ancient traditions of heroic resistance. The Welsh revival movement, led by scholars like Ifa Williams and literary figures like Saunders Lewis, focused on preserving and promoting Welsh language and culture through renewed engagement with medieval Welsh literature. Williams's scholarly work on early Welsh poetry revealed the sophisticated literary traditions that had preserved mythological material in Wales, while his translations made these works accessible to contemporary Welsh speakers. The movement's emphasis on linguistic authenticity created new interest in learning Welsh while establishing connections between ancient literary traditions and modern Welsh identity. Scottish Celtic revival took different forms depending on regional linguistic and cultural conditions. In the Highlands, the collection and publication of Gaelic folklore by scholars like Alexander Carmichael preserved oral traditions that had maintained Celtic mythological elements despite centuries of cultural suppression. Carmichael's Carmina Gadelica, published in multiple volumes between 1900 and 1971, documented prayers, charms, and stories that reveal the persistence of pre-Christian Celtic beliefs within Highland Scottish culture. The work demonstrated how Celtic mythology had survived through adaptation to Christian contexts while maintaining its essential character and cultural significance. The revival's influence on Scottish national identity became particularly evident in the romanticisation of Highland culture that emerged during the 19th century. The novels of Sir Walter Scott, while historically inaccurate in many details, popularised Celtic themes and imagery that influenced Scottish self-perception and international reputation. The revival of Highland games, clan gatherings and traditional music created new contexts for expressing Scottish identity that drew upon Celtic cultural traditions, while adapting them to contemporary social and political circumstances. The modern neo-pagan movement that emerged in the 20th century represented a more radical attempt to reconstruct Celtic religious practices based on mythological sources and archaeological evidence. Unlike the 19th century revival, which primarily focused on literary and cultural appreciation, neo-paganism sought to create functional religious systems that could serve contemporary spiritual needs while maintaining connections to ancient Celtic traditions. The movement's diverse approaches ranged from scholarly attempts at historical reconstruction to eclectic spiritual practices that combined Celtic elements with other religious traditions. Wicca, developed by Gerald Gardner in the 1940s and 1950s, incorporated Celtic deities and seasonal festivals into a modern witchcraft tradition that claimed ancient origins. Gardner's books Witchcraft Today and The Meaning of Witchcraft presented Celtic mythology as evidence for the survival of pre-Christian European religions, though his historical claims were largely unsupported by scholarly evidence. Despite its questionable historical foundations, Wicca's emphasis on Celtic seasonal festivals and nature worship attracted thousands of practitioners who found meaning in its combination of ancient symbolism and modern spiritual practice. Celtic Reconstructionism emerged in the 1980s as a more historically rigorous approach to reviving Celtic religious practices. This movement emphasised careful study of primary sources, archaeological evidence, and linguistic research to create religious practices that maintained authenticity to ancient Celtic traditions. Reconstructionists rejected the eclectic borrowing that characterised other neo-pagan movements, instead focusing on specific Celtic cultural traditions, Irish, Welsh, Scottish, or Breton, and attempting to understand their religious practices within their original cultural contexts. The Reconstructionist approach required extensive scholarly preparation, as practitioners needed to master ancient Celtic languages, understand archaeological evidence, and interpret mythological sources within their historical contexts. The movement's emphasis on cultural authenticity created communities of practitioners who combined religious devotion with serious academic study, producing scholarship that contributed to broader understanding of Celtic religious traditions while serving contemporary spiritual needs. Druidry experienced a particularly complex revival that combined romantic imagination with attempts at historical reconstruction. The ancient order of Druids, founded in 1781, represented an early attempt to revive Druidical traditions, though its practices owed more to Freemasonry than to ancient Celtic religion. The order's emphasis on moral instruction, charitable work and fraternal fellowship attracted thousands of members throughout the British Empire, while creating a romanticised image of Druidism that influenced popular culture. Modern Druidry movements have attempted to create more historically accurate practices based on classical sources and Celtic mythological material. Organisations like Arandriocht Fen and the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids have developed training programs that combine study of Celtic mythology with practical spiritual exercises designed to recreate ancient Druidical practices. These movements emphasize the Druids' roles as mediators between human and natural worlds, creating contemporary practices that focus on environmental awareness and seasonal celebration. The influence of Celtic mythology on modern literature extends far beyond the Celtic revival to encompass fantasy fiction, science fiction, and contemporary literary works that draw upon Celtic themes and motifs. J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth, while not explicitly Celtic, incorporated numerous elements from Celtic mythology, including the concept of the Otherworld, the departure of magical beings from the mortal world, and the emphasis on the relationship between language and cultural identity. Tolkien's academic background in medieval literature provided him with detailed knowledge of Celtic sources that influenced his creative work while establishing fantasy literature as a legitimate literary genre. Contemporary fantasy authors like Ursula K. Le Guin, Patricia Briggs, and Charles de Lint have explicitly drawn upon Celtic mythological sources to create works that explore themes of environmental responsibility, spiritual transformation, and the relationship between ancient wisdom and modern life. Le Guin's Earthsea cycle incorporates Celtic concepts of naming and magical power, while Briggs's Mercy Thompson series updates Celtic shape-shifting traditions for contemporary urban fantasy. De Lint's work, set in the fictional city of Newford, demonstrate how Celtic mythology can be adapted to modern urban environments while maintaining its essential character and spiritual significance. The influence of Celtic mythology on popular culture extends beyond literature to encompass film, television, music, and video games that have introduced Celtic themes to global audiences. Movies like The Secret of Kells and Song of the Sea have brought Irish, mythological material to international attention through innovative animation that captures the visual aesthetics of Celtic art. Television series like Merlin and The Witcher have adapted Celtic Arthurian material for contemporary audiences while maintaining connections to medieval sources. Celtic music has experienced a remarkable revival that has introduced traditional melodies and instruments to global audiences while creating new forms of musical expression that combine ancient and modern elements. Artists like the Chieftains, Clannad, and Lorena McKennitt have achieved international success by adapting traditional Celtic music for contemporary audiences, often incorporating mythological themes and imagery into their performances. The success of Celtic music has created new interest in Celtic culture while providing economic opportunities for communities in Celtic territories. The academic study of Celtic mythology has evolved into a sophisticated interdisciplinary field that combines literary analysis, archaeological research, linguistic study, and comparative mythology to understand Celtic cultures within their historical contexts. Modern scholars like Princius MacKenna, Miranda Green, and Barry Cunliffe have produced comprehensive studies that synthesize textual and material evidence to create nuanced understanding of Celtic religious and cultural traditions. Their work has corrected many of the romantic misconceptions that characterized earlier Celtic studies while revealing the genuine sophistication of Celtic civilization. Archaeological discoveries continue to provide new insights into Celtic religious practices and mythological traditions. The discovery of the Gundestrup cauldron in Denmark revealed the international scope of Celtic artistic traditions, while excavations at sites like Ribemont-sur-Ancre in France have provided evidence for the ritual practices that underlay Celtic mythological narratives. The application of new archaeological techniques, including environmental archaeology and isotope analysis, has revealed details about Celtic daily life and religious practices that illuminate the cultural contexts within which mythological traditions developed. The development of Celtic studies as an academic discipline has created institutional support for research and teaching that ensures the continued study and preservation of Celtic mythological traditions. Universities throughout Europe and North America offer programs in Celtic studies that combine language instruction with cultural and historical analysis. The establishment of research centres like the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies and the University of Wales Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies has provided resources for scholars while creating communities of researchers who collaborate on international projects. The digitisation of Celtic manuscripts and archaeological databases has revolutionised access to primary sources while creating new opportunities for collaborative research. Projects like the Irish Script on Screen and the Celtic Inscribed Stones project have made rare manuscripts and archaeological evidence available to researchers worldwide while preserving fragile materials for future study. The development of digital humanities techniques has enabled new forms of analysis that reveal patterns in Celtic mythological material that were previously difficult to detect. The contemporary relevance of Celtic mythology extends beyond academic study to encompass broader cultural and spiritual concerns that resonate with modern audiences. The Celtic emphasis on the relationship between human communities and the natural world has particular relevance for contemporary environmental movements that seek alternatives to industrial civilization's destructive relationship with nature. Celtic concepts of sacred landscape and seasonal celebration provide models for sustainable living that integrate human activity with natural cycles. The Celtic understanding of the otherworld as a realm accessible through specific practices and states of consciousness has influenced contemporary spiritual movements that seek direct experience of transcendent reality. The emphasis on poetic inspiration and artistic creation as forms of spiritual practice has attracted artists and writers who find meaning in Celtic concepts of creativity as divine gift. The Celtic tradition of honouring ancestors and maintaining connections to cultural heritage has provided models for communities seeking to preserve their identity while adapting to changing circumstances. The psychological dimensions of Celtic mythology continue to attract attention from scholars and practitioners who find in these ancient stories insights into human nature and spiritual development. The Celtic hero's journey, with its emphasis on supernatural trials and tragic inevitability, provides alternative models to the more optimistic heroic narratives that dominate contemporary popular culture. The complex relationship between individual achievement and collective responsibility that characterises Celtic heroic ideals offers perspectives on leadership and social obligation that remain relevant for contemporary political and social challenges. The global spread of Celtic cultural influence through migration, cultural exchange, and popular media has created international communities of people who find meaning in Celtic traditions while adapting them to their own cultural contexts. Celtic festivals are now celebrated worldwide, from the Highland Games in North America to Celtic music festivals in Asia, demonstrating the universal appeal of Celtic cultural themes. The establishment of Celtic cultural organisations in countries with significant Celtic diaspora populations has created networks that maintain connections to Celtic traditions while fostering new forms of cultural expression. The future of Celtic mythology appears secure through the combined efforts of academic scholars, cultural practitioners, and popular artists who continue to find meaning and inspiration in these ancient traditions. The ongoing discovery of new archaeological evidence, the development of more sophisticated analytical techniques, and the creation of new artistic works ensure that Celtic mythology will continue to evolve while maintaining its essential character. The digital preservation of Celtic manuscripts and artifacts guarantees that future generations will have access to these cultural treasures, while new technologies create unprecedented opportunities for analysis and interpretation. The enduring appeal of Celtic mythology lies in its sophisticated understanding of the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world, its emphasis on the transformative power of artistic creation, and its recognition of the tragic beauty that characterizes human existence. These themes remain relevant for contemporary audiences who seek meaning in a world that often seems disconnected from natural rhythms and spiritual significance. Celtic mythology's emphasis on the interconnectedness of all existence, the importance of maintaining cultural memory, and the possibility of transcending ordinary consciousness through artistic and spiritual practice continues to offer guidance for individuals and communities seeking authentic ways of living in the modern world. The Celtic mythological tradition represents one of Europe's most sophisticated attempts to understand the relationship between human consciousness and cosmic order, preserving through oral tradition and medieval manuscripts a worldview that recognized the sacred dimensions of everyday existence, while acknowledging the tragic limitations that constrain human achievement. Its influence on subsequent European culture, from medieval Arthurian romance to contemporary fantasy literature, demonstrates the enduring power of these ancient stories to inspire new forms of artistic expression, while providing frameworks for understanding the perennial human concerns of love, death, honor, and transcendence. The continued study and appreciation of Celtic mythology ensures that these ancient voices will continue to speak to future generations, offering wisdom gained through centuries of human experience and preserved through the dedication of countless storytellers, scholars, and artists who recognize their enduring value for understanding the human condition.